Sheriff Carolyn Mitchell had always believed that the worst crimes happened in cities where anonymity bred darkness, and crowds provided cover for predators. After 18 years serving Blackwater County, Montana, a sprawling territory of 4,200 square miles, containing more cattle than people, she thought she'd seen everything the rural landscape could offer. Domestic disputes that turned deadly during long winter months, hunting accidents that weren't quite accidents, the occasional meth lab hidden in abandoned farmsteads. But nothing had prepared her for what began on a fog-shrouded morning in late October 2019, when a rancher's dog led them to something that would shatter her understanding of how evil could flourish in the isolation of America's heartland. The call came in at 6:47 a.m., just as Mitchell was finishing her second cup of coffee and reviewing the duty roster for her 8-deputy department. The caller was Frank Kowalski, a third-generation cattle rancher whose property bordered the Yellowstone River, 37 mi northeast of the county seat of Millbrook. Frank's voice carried an unusual tremor. Unusual because in all the years Mitchell had known him, she'd never heard the man sound anything but completely steady. "Sheriff, you need to get out here," Frank said without preamble. "My dog found something in the east pasture. Something that ain't right." "What kind of something?" Frank Mitchell asked, already reaching for her duty belt. In rural law enforcement, something that ain't right could range from illegal dumping to discovered marijuana grows. But the tension in Frank's voice suggested this was different. "Human remains," Frank replied flatly. "At least what's left of them. Been there a while, I'd guess. But Sheriff?" He paused, and she could hear him taking a deep breath. "It's not just that there's a body, it's how it's arranged." 25 minutes later, Mitchell's patrol vehicle was kicking up dust along the washboard ranch road leading to Frank's property. The October morning mist clung to the valley floor, creating an ethereal landscape where fence posts emerged from gray, nothing like ghostly sentinels. As she turned into Frank's gravel driveway, she could see him waiting by his porch, a stocky man in his 60s, wearing the eternal uniform of ranchers everywhere, faded jeans, worn boots, and a jacket that had seen better decades. His border collie, Max, sat beside him with unusual stillness. "Appreciate you coming out so quick, Sheriff," Frank said as Mitchell approached. "I wasn't sure if I should call you or the coroner first." "You did right calling me," Mitchell assured him. "Where exactly did Max find this?" Frank gestured toward a distant tree line. "About half a mile, out near the old stock pond. Haven't run cattle in that section for 2 years. Too many gopher holes. Max was chasing rabbits when he started, carrying on like he'd found something big." He paused, his weathered face troubled. "Sheriff, I've seen dead things before. Plenty of them. This is different." They took Frank's ATV across the uneven pasture, the morning air crisp enough to sting exposed skin. The stock pond Frank mentioned was one of several scattered across his 2,800-acre spread, created decades earlier to water cattle during summer grazing. Now it was little more than a depression surrounded by willows and cottonwoods, the water, level too low to be useful. As they approached the treeline, Mitchell began to smell it, the sweet, sickening odor of advanced decomposition that every law enforcement officer learns to recognize and never quite forgets. Max began whining and refused to go closer, which Frank noted was unusual behavior for a dog that regularly encountered dead livestock. "Right through there," Frank said, pointing toward a gap in the willows. "I didn't touch nothing, just looked close enough to be sure of what I was seeing." Mitchell retrieved her camera and evidence kit from the ATV, then pushed through the vegetation. What she found in the small clearing beyond stopped her cold. Not just because of the remains themselves, but because of how they had been deliberately and carefully arranged. The skeleton was nearly complete, clothed in the tattered remnants of what appeared to have been jeans and a flannel shirt. But this wasn't how a body naturally decomposes when left exposed to the elements. Someone had positioned the bones with meticulous care, creating a tableau that spoke of ritual and intention. The skeleton lay on its back, arms crossed over the chest, surrounded by a perfect circle of stones. Each stone was roughly the size of a human fist, and they had been placed with mathematical precision, 12 ft in diameter. More disturbing were the personal effects. A wallet lay open beside the remains, its contents carefully arranged. Driver's license, credit cards, family photos, and cash. $43 in small bills. This wasn't robbery. This was presentation. Mitchell photographed everything, from multiple angles before examining the driver's license. The name read Marcus Webb with an address in Great Falls, some 180 miles south. The date of birth indicated Webb would have been 34 years old. The license had expired 3 years earlier. "Frank," she called back toward the tree line. "I need you to think carefully. Have you ever seen this setup before? Anything like it on your property or around the county?" Frank's voice came back muffled by the vegetation. "Never seen nothing like that in my life, Sheriff. And I've been working this land for 40 years. Mitchell spent another 20 minutes documenting the scene before calling her deputy, Sarah Chen, to request backup in the county coroner. As she waited, she studied the arrangement more carefully, noting details that made her increasingly uneasy. The stones in the circle weren't random rocks found nearby. They appeared to be granite, foreign to this area's predominantly limestone geology. Someone had brought them here specifically for this purpose. The positioning of the remains suggested the person had been placed here after decomposition was well advanced. Soft tissue decomposition in Montana's climate would take different amounts of time depending on the season. But the condition of the clothing and the complete skeletonization suggested Marcus Webb had been dead for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Deputy Chen arrived 45 minutes later, followed by County Coroner Dr. James Reeves. Chen was Mitchell's most experienced deputy, a former Army MP who joined the department 5 years earlier after completing her criminal justice degree. Dr. Reeves had been the county coroner for 12 years, a soft-spoken man who'd performed autopsies in larger jurisdictions before accepting the quieter pace of rural Montana. "Well, this is a first," Dr. Reeves commented as he studied the scene. "In all my years, I've never seen remains arranged like this. This took time, Sheriff. And knowledge." "Knowledge of what?" Mitchell asked. "Human anatomy, for starters. Whoever did this understood skeletal structure well enough to reassemble these remains anatomically correctly. That's not something most people could do, even with a medical textbook." Chen had been photographing the scene from different angles. "Sheriff, look at this," she said, pointing to the ground just outside the stone circle. "Footprints. Looks like boot treads, size 11 or 12 maybe, and they're not fresh. Been here through at least one rain cycle, but they're still visible." Mitchell knelt to examine the prints. "Can we get casts?" "Should be able to," Chen confirmed. Soil's got enough clay content to hold the impression. As the team worked to document and process the scene, Mitchell found herself studying the surrounding area with growing unease. The location wasn't random. It was secluded enough to avoid casual discovery, but accessible enough for someone to bring the remains here along with the stones. The killer, and this was clearly a homicide despite the lack of obvious trauma to the bones, had chosen this spot for specific reasons. "Dr. Reeves," she asked, "how long would it take for remains to reach this level of decomposition in our climate?" The coroner considered the question while examining the bones more closely. "Depends on multiple factors. Time of year, whether the body was initially buried or left exposed, presence of scavengers. But looking at the condition of the clothing and the complete absence of soft tissue, I'd estimate a minimum of 18 months, possibly up to 3 years. The wallet's contents provided their first real lead. Along with Marcus Webb's identification, they found a business card for High Country Surveying with a Great Falls address and phone number. There was also what appeared to be a receipt from a gas station, but the ink was too faded to read clearly. "I'll run Webb through NCIC when we get back," Chen said, referring to the National Crime Information Center database. "See if anyone reported him missing." Mitchell nodded, but her attention was drawn to something else. "Frank, come here a minute," she called to the rancher, who had been waiting respectfully at the tree line. "This stock pond, how long has it been dry?" Frank approached, still keeping his distance from the remains. "Oh, that's been dry for the better part of 5 years now. Haven't pumped water to it since I moved the herd rotation to the south sections, but it would fill during spring runoff." Sure, wood gets about 4 feet deep most years when the snow melts. Mitchell studied the relationship between the pond and the clearing. During high water, the arranged remains would be completely hidden from view. Only during the dry months would they be visible, and only to someone specifically entering the grove of trees. The killer had chosen this location knowing the seasonal patterns. "Dr. Reeves, I need your preliminary examination completed as quickly as possible," Mitchell said. "And I want to know if there's any evidence of trauma that caused death." "Of course, Sheriff. I'll transport the remains this afternoon and have a preliminary report within 48 hours. As they prepared to remove the remains, Mitchell took one final survey of the scene. The meticulous arrangement, the imported stones, the careful placement of personal effects. This wasn't the work of someone who had killed in passion or desperation. This was deliberate, ritualistic, and suggested a level of planning that made her deeply uncomfortable. The drive back to Millbrook gave Mitchell time to process what they discovered. Blackwater County had seen its share of deaths over the years, but nothing approaching this level of calculated presentation. She found herself mentally reviewing similar cases from her training and professional reading, but nothing quite matched the specific details of what they'd found at Frank's ranch. Back at the department, Chen immediately began running Marcus Webb through various databases. Within an hour, she had preliminary results. "Sheriff, we've got a hit," Chen announced. Marcus Webb was reported missing to the Great Falls Police Department on August 15, 2017. Last seen leaving his apartment with surveying equipment, supposedly heading out on a multi-day job. His girlfriend filed the report when he didn't return, as scheduled. Mitchell looked up from her case notes. "That's over 2 years ago. Did Great Falls follow up?" According to their report, they conducted a standard missing person investigation, interviewed the girlfriend, checked with his employer, looked into his financial records. No signs of foul play, no suspicious activity on his credit cards or bank accounts after he disappeared. Case went cold after about 6 months. What about the surveying company? High Country. Jen consulted her notes. Still in business. I spoke with the owner, a guy named Peterson. He confirmed Webb was a contract surveyor who worked for them regularly, but he wasn't on any job for their company when he disappeared. Peterson assumed Webb was working independently, which wasn't unusual. The information painted a picture of a man who had simply vanished while conducting routine work in rural Montana. Exactly the kind of case that could go unnoticed for years, in a state where vast empty spaces swallowed people with disturbing regularity. "Any family besides the girlfriend?" Mitchell asked. "Parents deceased, one brother in Seattle who didn't stay in regular contact. The girlfriend, Jennifer Moss, was pretty much his only local connection." Mitchell studied the evidence photos they'd printed, focusing on the meticulous arrangement of the remains. "Sarah, I want you to contact surrounding counties. See if they've had any similar discoveries. Body found arranged in a circle of stones. Personal effects deliberately displayed. This level of organization, this wasn't someone's first time." That evening, Mitchell found herself unable to shake the image of Marcus Webb's carefully arranged remains. She'd seen enough crime scenes to develop a professional detachment, but something about the calculated nature of this discovery bothered her in a way she couldn't quite define. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Millbrook, a choice she'd made after her divorce 3 years earlier. Tonight, the isolation that usually provided peaceful solitude felt different, heavier, somehow. Her phone rang at 9:47 p.m. The caller ID showed Chen's number. "Sheriff, sorry to bother you at home, but I think we might have a problem," Jen said without preamble. "I've been working the computer all evening, expanding the search parameters. I found something in Glacier County." Mitchell sat up straighter, in her recliner. "What kind of something?" "Body discovered 18 months ago, arranged in a circle of stones. Victim was a hunting guide named Thomas Brennan from Whitefish. Remains were significantly decomposed when found. Personal effects laid out beside the body." Jesus, Mitchell breathed. "Who worked the case?" "Sheriff's deputy named Martinez. I spoke with him about an hour ago. He said it was the strangest thing he'd seen in 20 years of law enforcement. They never solved it. No suspects, No leads. Mitchell was already reaching for her notebook. Any other similarities? Time frame? Victim profile. Brennan disappeared during elk season 2016. Professional outdoorsman, worked alone frequently. Knew the back country like his own backyard. When he didn't return from a solo scouting trip, his outfitter assumed he decided to extend his time in the field. So, another case of someone whose absence wouldn't immediately raise alarms, Mitchell observed. Sarah, first thing tomorrow, I want you to expand that search. Check with Montana's neighboring states too, and get me everything Glacier County has on the Brennan case. After hanging up, Mitchell poured herself a glass of wine and stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the darkness beyond Millbrook's sparse streetlights. Somewhere in that vast landscape, a killer was operating. Someone organized enough to avoid detection, patient enough to wait years between killings, and methodical enough to turn murder into a twisted form of art. The next morning brought confirmation of Mitchell's worst fears. Chen had spent the night expanding her search, and the results were chilling. "Sheriff, we've got 4 confirmed cases across 3 states," Jen reported as Mitchell arrived at the office. "Mont, Wyoming, and North Dakota, all within the past 5 years, all showing the same signature. Remains arranged in stone circles. Personal effects displayed. Victims who worked alone in rural areas." Mitchell poured coffee and studied the map Chen had created, marking each discovery location with red pins. The geographic distribution covered hundreds of miles, but when connected, they formed a rough pattern following major highway corridors and seasonal migration routes. "Tell me about the other victims," Mitchell said. Chen consulted her notes. Wyoming case from 2018. Ranch hand named Michael Torres disappeared while checking fence lines in remote grazing areas. Found 8 months later by hunters. North Dakota case from 2017. Geologist named Dr. Sarah Kim vanished during a field research trip, found by a survey crew the following spring. And there's one more in Montana. Flathead County 2016 wilderness. Photographer named David Chen. No relation to me. Disappeared while documenting wildfire recovery areas. Same MO for all of them. Identical. Stone circles. Bodies positioned identically. Personal effects arranged the same way. The killer's not. Just consistent. He's compulsive about the details. Mitchell studied the timeline. If these are all connected, we're looking at a serial killer who's been operating for at least 4 years, possibly longer. Sarah, I want you to coordinate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. This crosses state lines and shows clear serial behavior. Already in progress, Sheriff. I have a call scheduled with Special Agent Rodriguez this afternoon. The investigation was expanding beyond what Blackwater County could handle alone. But Mitchell felt a deep responsibility to see it through. Marcus Webb had been found in her jurisdiction, making him her case, her responsibility to his family, and memory. "What about the geographic pattern?" she asked, studying the map. "Any connections between the dump sites?" Chen had clearly been thinking about the same question. All remote, but accessible. All near water sources, either rivers, creeks, or seasonal ponds. All in areas where seasonal changes would affect visibility or accessibility. The killer knows these landscapes intimately. Someone local to the region. That's my working theory. This isn't a trucker or traveling salesman. Someone this familiar with remote locations across 3 states either lives here year-round or spends significant time here regularly. Mitchell's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Reeves. "Preliminary autopsy complete. Can you come in this afternoon? Found something significant. The county coroner's office occupied the basement level of Millbrook's small hospital." Doctor. Reeves had converted 2 rooms into an adequate morgue and autopsy facility, sufficient for the county's typical needs, but barely adequate for a case of this complexity. "Sheriff, thank you for coming so quickly," Dr. Reeves said as he led her into the examination room. Marcus Webb's remains were laid out on the metal table, cleaned and arranged anatomically. "I've completed the preliminary examination, and there are several significant findings." Mitchell approached the table, steeling herself against the clinical reality of what had once been a living person. "What can you tell me about cause of death?" "That's where it gets interesting," Doctor said, pointing to the skull. See this fracture pattern here along the temporal bone? This is consistent with blunt force trauma, but not from a typical weapon. Mitchell leaned closer to examine the damage. What kind of instrument? Something cylindrical, approximately 2 in diameter. The impact pattern suggests significant force, enough to cause immediate incapacitation and likely death. A pipe, baseball bat possibly. But look at this. Dr. Reeves indicated a series of parallel scratches on several of the long bones. These marks are post-mortem made after decomposition was well advanced. Someone used metal tools to clean these bones. The implication sent a chill through Mitchell. You're saying the killer came back? More than once, I'd estimate. The positioning we found that level of anatomical accuracy doesn't happen naturally. Someone reassembled these remains periodically, probably over the course of months or years. The revelation fundamentally changed Mitchell's understanding of the case. This wasn't just murder. It was ongoing ritual behavior. The killer maintained relationships with his victims even after death, returning to their remains repeatedly. Dr. Reeves, I need you to document everything. Every tool mark, every fracture pattern. If this is what I think it is, this evidence is going to be crucial. That evening, Mitchell called a meeting with her senior deputies to discuss the expanding scope of the investigation. The conference room in the sheriff's department was cramped for more than 4 people, but it would have to do. As of today, we're officially investigating what appears to be a multi-state serial killing, she announced to deputies Jen, Rodriguez, and Thompson. 4 confirmed cases, possibly more. The FBI is taking the lead on the interstate coordination, but this is still our case for the Marcus Webb murder. Deputy Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who transferred from Billings 5 years earlier, raised his hand. Sheriff, what kind of resources are we looking at? Our department's not equipped for something this big. The state will provide additional manpower and forensic support, Mitchell replied. The FBI will coordinate with the other jurisdictions, but I want our team to stay focused on the local aspects. Anyone with connections to the area where Webb was found, anyone with the knowledge and access to place those remains. Deputy Thompson, the youngest member of the team, looked troubled. Sheriff, if this guy's been operating for years without being caught, what makes us think we can get him now? It was a fair question, and one Mitchell had been asking herself. Because this time, he made a mistake, she said. Frank Kowalski's dog found those remains during an unusual drought year. The stock pond that normally would have hidden the site stayed dry longer than usual. Our killer's pattern depends on environmental factors he can't completely control. Jen spread out the geographic map she'd created. I've been thinking about the logistics. Moving remains, transporting stones, accessing remote sites repeatedly. This requires vehicle access and local knowledge. Sheriff, I think our killer lives within this region. The map showed a rough circle encompassing parts of 3 states with Millbrook near the center. If Chen was right, they were looking for someone local, someone who might be hiding in plain sight within their own community. Starting tomorrow, I want everyone to think about this case differently, Mitchell announced. This isn't just about solving Marcus Webb's murder. We're hunting someone who's been killing people across this region for years. Someone who thinks he's smarter than rural law enforcement. As the meeting broke up, Mitchell found herself staring at the evidence photos once again. The careful arrangement of bones, the imported stones, the meticulous display of personal effects, all of it spoke to someone with profound psychological needs that required regular satisfaction. Somewhere in the vast landscape of rural Montana, a killer was probably planning his next move, and unless they could identify him quickly, another solitary worker would disappear into the empty spaces where screams went unheard and bodies could lie undisturbed for years. Mitchell locked the evidence photos in her desk and headed home, unaware that less than 50 and away, a woman named Patricia Vance was packing surveying equipment into her truck, preparing for a week-long boundary mapping job in one of the most remote sections of the region. Patricia had no way of knowing that someone had been watching her prepare for this trip, studying her routines, her equipment, her planned route into areas where cell phone coverage disappeared, and the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away. In a region where independence and self-reliance were cultural imperatives, Patricia saw nothing unusual about spending a week alone in the wilderness. It was part of her job, part of the lifestyle she'd chosen when she moved to Montana 5 years earlier. As she loaded the last of her supplies, Patricia noticed a pickup truck parked across the street from her apartment. The driver appeared to be reading something, paying no attention to her activities. She thought nothing of it. After all, in a small town like Millbrook, everyone knew everyone's business. Someone sitting in their truck was hardly worth a second thought. But if Patricia had looked more carefully, she might have noticed that the truck's license plate was obscured by mud, or that the driver kept glancing up from his newspaper to watch her loading her surveying equipment. She might have noticed that this was the same truck that had been parked near the surveyor's office when she'd picked up her assignment earlier that week. Most importantly, she might have recognized the patient, calculating attention of someone who was learning her patterns, her routes, her planned isolation in areas where help was days away and bodies could lie undiscovered for years. But Patricia Vance noticed none of these things. She finished loading her truck, double-checked her route maps, and drove out of Millbrook just as the sun was setting, heading toward a rendezvous she didn't know had been planned for her by someone whose interest in her was anything but professional. Sheriff Mitchell would receive the first call about Patricia's overdue return in 4 days. By then, the killer would have had plenty of time to begin his careful ritualistic work in a place where the only witnesses were the endless Montana sky and the wind moving through grass that would soon grow over freshly disturbed earth. The call came in at 2:17 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, exactly 4 days after Patricia Vance had driven out of Millbrook toward what should have been a routine week-long surveying job. The caller was Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley Surveying Services and Patricia's employer for the past 18 months. Sheriff Mitchell, I'm probably worrying over nothing, but Patricia was supposed to check in yesterday. Bradley's voice carried the careful concern of someone trying not to sound alarmist. She's working the Henderson Ranch boundary survey up near Crow's Nest Ridge. Patricia's reliable, never misses a check-in. When I couldn't raise her on the radio this morning, I started getting nervous. Mitchell felt her stomach tighten. After the discovery of Marcus Webb's remains and the connection to similar cases across 3 states, any missing person report involving someone working alone in remote areas triggered immediate alarm. How long was she supposed to be out there? 7 days total, with daily radio check-ins at 6 p.m. Last contact was Monday evening, right on schedule. Said she'd completed the eastern boundary and was moving to the higher elevations on Tuesday. What's her exact location, Tom? Bradley provided GPS coordinates for Patricia's planned survey area, a section of the Henderson Ranch that bordered national forest land, approximately 45 miles northeast of Millbrook. It was remote country, accessible only by Forest Service roads that were often impassable after heavy rains. I'm heading out there now, Mitchell told him. How long to reach your last known position? About an hour and a half in good weather. Sheriff Patricia's experienced. She knows the country, carries proper safety equipment, always files detailed route plans. This isn't like her. Mitchell was already reaching for her keys. Tom, I need you to fax me her route plan and any maps she was using, and I want a complete list of her equipment, radio frequencies, vehicle description, everything. 20 minutes later, Mitchell was heading northeast out of Millbrook with Deputy Chen riding passenger. They'd loaded the department's ATV in case Patricia's route required off-road access, and Chen had established radio contact with the State Police Coordination Center. Anything from the FBI on similar disappearances? Mitchell asked as they drove. Agent Rodriguez called this morning, Chen replied, consulting her notes. They've identified 2 additional cases that might fit the pattern. One in Colorado from 2015, another in South Dakota from 2018, both involving solo workers in remote areas. Both found arranged in stone circles. 6 states now looks that way. Rodriguez thinks we're dealing with someone who follows seasonal work patterns or has some other reason to travel regularly across the northern plains and Rocky Mountain regions. The landscape grew progressively more rugged as they drove, rolling grassland, giving way to broken terrain cut by dry washes and scattered stands of pine. This was country where a person could disappear completely, where searches could take weeks to cover the vast empty spaces between roads. Patricia's abandoned truck was found exactly where her route plan indicated it should be. parked beside a Forest Service gate that marked the beginning of foot access into the Henderson Ranch's remote sections. The vehicle was unlocked with Patricia's purse and cell phone visible on the seat. Her surveying equipment was missing. No signs of struggle, Chen observed as they examined the truck. Keys in the ignition, personal belongings undisturbed. Mitchell studied the area around the vehicle. Beyond the gate, a rough trail led upward through sparse pine forest toward the ridge Patricia had been mapping. Boot prints in the soft earth showed her path clearly. Size 7 hiking boots consistent with Patricia's physical description. Sarah, call Tom Bradley. I want to know if Patricia's radio has GPS tracking capability. While Chen made the call, Mitchell followed the trail for several hundred yards, noting that Patricia's footprints continued steadily upward with no signs of deviation or distress. Whatever had happened to her, it hadn't occurred here. Chen caught up with news from Bradley. Patricia's radio does have GPS, but it's been offline since Tuesday morning. Last location ping was about 2 mi up this trail, near a place called Devil's Canyon. They returned to the truck for the ATV, knowing that 2 mi of mountain terrain would take hours to cover on foot. The trail was barely wide enough for the machine, requiring careful navigation around fallen logs and washouts. Devil's Canyon proved to be a dramatic cut in the landscape, a narrow gorge perhaps 50 ft deep with steep rock walls. Patricia's trail led to the rim where her footprints suddenly became confused, multiple overlapping impressions suggesting she had spent considerable time in one small area. "Look at this," Jen called from a few yards away. She was kneeling beside a small aluminum stake with fluorescent flagging tape, part of Patricia's surveying equipment. This is positioned exactly where her GPS showed the last signal. Mitchell joined her, studying the surrounding area. But where's the rest of her equipment? The GPS unit, her measuring instruments. They spent an hour systematically searching the canyon rim and the surrounding forest, finding only 2 more survey stakes and a small notebook with Patricia's field notes. The last entry was dated Tuesday morning and read simply, "Anomalous reading at the Station 7. Investigate further." Sarah, what kind of anomalous reading would a surveyor find interesting enough to investigate? Chen shrugged. Could be anything. Underground cavity, mineral deposits, unusual geological formations. Without more context, it's impossible to know. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Mitchell made the decision to call for additional search resources. This is now a missing person case with possible connection to our serial investigation. I want search teams, dogs, and air support if the weather holds. The search operation began the following morning with 12 personnel, sheriff's deputies, state police, and volunteers from the county search and rescue team. Helicopter support was delayed due to morning fog, but ground teams began systematic coverage of the area around Devil's Canyon. At 11:30 a.m., search dog handler Janet Morris radioed from a position approximately half a mile south of the canyon. "Sheriff, I need you to see this. Greta is indicating something, but it's unusual." Mitchell and Chen hiked quickly to Morris's position, finding her standing beside a small clearing in a grove of aspen trees. Greta, a German shepherd trained in both live person and cadaver detection, was sitting in a classic alert position beside a circle of stones. Mitchell's blood went cold. The stone circle was identical to the one they'd found with Marcus. Webs, remains 12 ft in diameter, granite stone spaced with mathematical precision. But this circle was empty except for a small pile of surveying equipment in its center. "That's Patricia's GPS unit," Jen confirmed, examining the equipment without disturbing its arrangement and her measuring rod, notebook, everything she would have been carrying. The equipment had been arranged with the same careful attention to presentation they'd seen at the web crime scene. Patricia's notebook was open to her final entry about the anomalous reading. Her GPS unit displayed a waypoint marked simply as Station 7. "Janet, what exactly is Greta alerting to?" Mitchell asked. "Live scent or cadaver?" Morris frowned, clearly puzzled by her dog's behavior. "That's what's strange, Sheriff. She's giving a mixed signal, something I've never seen her do before. She's alerting to both scent types in the same location." Dr. Reeves arrived 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from the state forensics lab. The radar scan of the stone circle's interior showed a distinct anomaly approximately 3 ft below the surface. a large void space that suggested either a natural cavity or deliberately excavated area. "Sheriff, we need to excavate," Dr. Reeves announced, after reviewing the radar results. "Based on Greta's alert and these readings, there's a significant possibility we'll find human remains." The excavation began carefully with crime scene protocols observed despite the remote location. What they uncovered at a depth of 38 and stopped everyone at the site. It was a natural limestone cave approximately 8 ft long by 40 wide, with a ceiling height of about 3 ft. The cavity had been modified, the opening enlarged and carefully concealed with a fitted stone cap that had been invisible at ground level. Inside the cave, the search team found Patricia Vance. She was alive, but barely. Severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and restrained with climbing rope. Patricia had been imprisoned in the underground chamber for 3 days. Most disturbingly, someone had been caring for her, providing minimal water and basic medical attention to keep her alive while completely immobilizing her. As Patricia was evacuated for emergency medical treatment, Mitchell examined the cave more thoroughly. It had been prepared as a long-term holding facility. The walls showed tool marks where the natural cavity had been enlarged. A small camp, stove provided heat and containers of water, and basic provisions indicated someone intended to keep victims alive for extended periods. "This changes everything," Jen observed as crime scene technicians documented the underground prison. "This isn't just a killing site, it's a preparation area." Mitchell nodded grimly. "He keeps them alive while he gets ready for whatever comes next. Sarah, I want this entire area searched with ground-penetrating radar. If there's one cave there, might be others." The expanded search revealed 2 additional modified caves within a 4-mile radius. Both were empty, but showed evidence of recent use. Tool marks in the stone, equipment for monitoring captives, and most chillingly carved tally marks on the walls indicating they had held multiple victims over time. Patricia Vance remained hospitalized but stable, drifting in and out of consciousness, as doctors treated her severe dehydration and exposure. When she was finally coherent enough to speak, her account of the ordeal provided the first direct witness testimony to the killer's methods. "He knew I was coming," Patricia whispered to Mitchell during their first interview at the hospital. "Not just that day, he knew my whole schedule, my route, everything. He was waiting when I reached Station 7. "Can you describe him?" Mitchell asked gently. Patricia's eyes closed as she struggled to recall details through the trauma and medications. Tall, maybe 6'2", wearing work clothes, jeans, flannel shirt, nothing unusual. But his hands, she shuddered. His hands were wrong. Too smooth, like he'd never done real manual labor despite the clothes. Age 40s, maybe early 50s. Brown hair, some gray. But Sheriff, the scary part wasn't how he looked. It was how he talked. Like we were old friends. Like he'd been planning this conversation for years. Patricia's account painted a picture of someone who approached his victims with elaborate preparation and psychological manipulation. He had immobilized her with a taser-like device, then spent considerable time explaining what he called the process, how he selected victims, prepared them, and eventually arranged their remains as what he termed monuments to solitude. He said, "The others were honored to be part of something permanent," Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger as the interview progressed. Said they understood eventually that their sacrifice was necessary to maintain the balance. Sheriff? He was. Completely insane, but he thought what he was doing was some kind of religious duty. Most importantly, Patricia remembered specific details about her captor's vehicle. A dark blue pickup truck with Montana plates and a distinctive dent in the left rear quarter panel. She also recalled hearing radio chatter from what sounded like emergency services communications, suggesting the killer monitored law enforcement frequencies. "Sarah, run the vehicle description through DMV records," Mitchell instructed as they left the hospital. Dark blue pickup, Montana plates, body damage. Cross-reference with any emergency services personnel, EMTs, firefighters, anyone with access to radio communications. Already in progress, Sheriff, but that description could match hundreds of vehicles in the region. The investigation took a dramatic turn when crime scene technicians processing Patricia's cave prison made an unexpected discovery. Hidden beneath a false floor constructed of fitted stone slabs, they found a cache of personal effects from multiple victims, wallets, jewelry, identification cards, and photographs spanning more than a decade. The collection was organized meticulously, with items from each victim stored in separate sealed containers, labeled with dates and locations. Most disturbing was a series of photographs showing victims in the caves before their deaths. Evidence of the killer's systematic documentation of his crimes. Among the recovered items was a driver's license belonging to Marcus Webb, confirming the connection between Patricia's abduction and the remains found at Frank Kowalski's ranch. But there were others. 13 additional sets of identification from victims whose remains had never been found. Jesus Christ, Chen breathed as they inventoried the evidence. He's been doing this for over 10 years. Look at these dates. The earliest victim was from 2009. Mitchell studied the photographs, forcing herself to examine each image despite their disturbing content. The killer had documented not just the victims themselves, but the caves where he held them, the tools he used, and most significantly, his own hands as he worked. "Sarah, look at this," she said, pointing to one of the photographs. His hands. Patricia was right. Look at the skin tone, the manicured nails. These aren't the hands of someone who does manual labor. Professional work. Then office job, maybe medical field, or someone who wears gloves regularly. Law enforcement, medical personnel, laboratory work. The realization that they might be looking for someone within the emergency services community was sobering. It would explain the killer's knowledge of police procedures, his ability to monitor radio communications, and his understanding of how missing person investigations were conducted in rural areas. FBI Special Agent Rodriguez arrived that evening to coordinate the multi-state investigation now involving 14 confirmed victims. A soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, Rodriguez brought resources and expertise that the local investigation desperately needed. "Sheriff Mitchell, based on the evidence you've recovered, we're dealing with someone who's been operating across a wide geographic area for over a decade," Rodriguez said, as they reviewed the case files. "The level of organization and preparation suggests someone with significant advantages: mobility, knowledge of law enforcement procedures, and access to remote areas across multiple states." "We're thinking emergency services," Mitchell replied. "Someone whose job requires travel and provides cover for being in remote locations." That fits the profile, but there's something else to consider. The ritualistic aspects of the crimes suggest deep psychological motivation. This isn't just about killing. He's creating something he sees as permanent and meaningful. Rodriguez spread out a map showing the locations where victims had been abducted and where remains had been found. The pattern revealed a systematic approach covering parts of 6 states with activity concentrated during specific months of the year. "Look at the timing," she continued. "Most abductions occur between April and October, the months when surveyors, geologists, and other outdoor professionals are most active." He's following seasonal work patterns. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, Patricia's employer, called Mitchell with information that had emerged during a routine review of his business records. "Sheriff, I was going through my client files trying to understand how someone might have known Patricia's schedule," Bradley explained. "I found something odd. Over the past 2 years, I've received several requests for copies of survey maps and boundary documents. Nothing unusual about that. Other surveyors sometimes need reference materials, but looking at them together, someone has been requesting information about every area where my people work. Who made the requests? That's the thing. They came from different sources, sometimes by mail, sometimes phone calls, once in person. But they all asked for the same type of information: detailed topographic maps, property boundaries, access routes." Bradley provided Mitchell with copies of the requests, including a business card left by the person who had visited his office in person. The card identified Robert Hansen as a geological consultant with a post office box in Billings. Chen's investigation of Robert Hansen revealed that the name was fictitious. No geological consultant by that name was licensed in Montana, and the Billings address was a mail drop service that had no record of anyone using that name. But Sheriff, look at this, Chen said, pointing to the business card under magnification. The paper stock, the printing quality, this was done professionally, not something made on a home computer. Local print shop, that's what I'm thinking. I'll canvass every printing business within 100 miles. While Chen pursued the printing lead, Mitchell focused on the geographic pattern of the crimes. Using a detailed topographic map, she marked every location where victims had been abducted, where remains had been found, and where the cave prisons had been discovered. The pattern that emerged was troubling in its implications. All of the sites were within a day's drive of major transportation corridors, but they were also positioned to take advantage of specific geological features, areas with natural limestone, caves that could be modified into holding facilities. He's not just selecting victims randomly, Mitchell realized. He's choosing locations based on their potential for creating these underground prisons that requires detailed geological knowledge. Dr. Reeves, who had been consulting with forensic specialists at the State Crime Lab, provided additional insight into the killer's methods. The tool marks we found in the caves, the modifications to the natural cavities. This work was done by someone with significant expertise in stone cutting and excavation. Construction background possibly, but more specialized. The precision of the cuts, the understanding of structural integrity. This is closer to restoration work, historic preservation maybe, or archaeological excavation. The investigation was interrupted by an urgent call from the state police. A motorist had discovered human remains arranged in a stone circle near the town of Fort Benton, approximately 120 kilometers southeast of Millbrook. The remains appeared to be recent, and the arrangement matched the signature pattern perfectly. Mitchell and Chen drove to Fort Benton that evening, arriving at the crime scene just as a state forensics team was beginning their documentation. The remains were those of a middle-aged man arranged in the familiar 12-oot stone circle, with personal effects displayed beside the bones. "Sheriff, this is different," the lead forensic technician informed them. "These remains are much more recent. Weeks, not years. And look at this." The victim's wallet was open beside the remains, showing identification for James Morrison, a freelance photographer from Missoula. But attached to the wallet was a handwritten note that hadn't been found at previous crime scenes. The note, written in neat block letters, read, "Sheriff Mitchell, you're getting close." But Patricia Vance was just a warning. "Stop looking for me, or the next one won't survive the caves." The direct threat changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. The killer was now aware that law enforcement was closing in, and he was escalating his behavior in response. Most chilling was the implication that Patricia's survival had been intentional, a message rather than an oversight. "He's watching the investigation," Rodriguez concluded after examining the note. "Someone with access to law enforcement communications were close enough to the investigation to know our progress." Mitchell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. If the killer was monitoring their activities, it meant he could be anyone. A member of the law enforcement community, an emergency services worker, or simply someone with access to police scanner technology. "Agent Rodriguez, I want everyone connected to this investigation background checked," Mitchell said. "I don't care if it's my own deputies. Everyone gets scrutinized." As they prepared to leave the Fort Benton crime scene, Mitchell's radio crackled, with an urgent transmission from the Blackwater County Dispatch. "Sheriff Mitchell, respond to Kowalski Ranch immediately. Frank reports someone's been in his east pasture, right where you found the first remains. Says they left something behind." The drive back to Frank's ranch took 45 minutes, during which Mitchell's mind raced through the implications. The killer returning to his first known crime scene suggested either extreme confidence or increasing desperation. Frank met them at his gate, clearly shaken by what he discovered. "Sheriff, I was checking the irrigation lines this evening when I saw vehicle tracks in the pasture. Fresh ones made since the rain 2 days ago. Thought it might be trespassers, so I followed them." He led them to the grove of willows where Marcus Webb's remains had been found months earlier. The stone circle was gone, the area apparently restored to its natural state. But in the center of the clearing, someone had constructed a new arrangement. 12 wooden stakes had been driven into the ground in a perfect circle, each topped with a small American flag. At the center of the circle sat a camping chair facing toward Millbrook with a pair of binoculars on the seat and a handwritten note pinned to the backrest. The note was longer than the one found at Fort Benton, written in the same neat block letters. Sheriff Mitchell, you found my sacred places, but you don't understand their purpose. Each circle honors someone who chose solitude over the false community of your towns and cities. They died as they lived, alone, dignified, permanent. Patricia Vance was a test. You passed by finding her quickly, but you failed by not understanding the lesson. The caves are not prisons. They are preparation chambers, where the chosen ones learn to embrace their destiny. I have been watching your investigation with interest. You are methodical, dedicated, and closer to the truth than the others who came before. But you are also naive if you think rural law enforcement can stop what has been ordained by the landscape itself. There will be others. The geological surveys continue. The boundary work expands, and solitary workers still venture into places where they belong. I am merely the instrument of their transition from temporary flesh to permanent monument. Look for me in the places where silence speaks loudest, where isolation becomes revelation. Look for me among those who understand that true community requires sacrifice, and that the empty spaces of our landscape demand their due. You cannot stop what you do not truly see. The Keeper of Silent Acres. Mitchell photographed the note in the arrangement before allowing the crime scene team to process the area. The killer's message revealed a delusional belief system that cast him as some kind of spiritual guardian of rural landscapes. But it also provided crucial insight into his psychology and methods. He's not just killing randomly, she told Rodriguez, as they studied the note. He believes he's fulfilling some kind of cosmic purpose, converting solitary workers into permanent monuments to isolation. The classic organized serial killer, Rodriguez agreed. Highly intelligent, believes his crimes serve a higher purpose, sees himself as superior to law enforcement. But Sheriff, this note also tells us he's starting to feel pressure. The direct communication, the return to a previous crime scene. These are signs of escalation. As they prepared to leave Frank's ranch, Mitchell made a decision that would prove crucial to breaking the case. Agent Rodriguez, I want to set up surveillance on this location. If our killer feels territorial about his crime scenes, he might come back again. You think he'll return? I think his psychological needs are stronger than his caution. This isn't just about the killings anymore. It's about maintaining control over his sacred places. And that might be his weakness. The surveillance operation began the following evening with 4 agents and deputies positioned around the Kowalski Ranch perimeter, using thermal imaging and night vision equipment. If the killer returned to monitor his message or observe law enforcement's response, they would be ready. What they couldn't have anticipated was that the killer's next move would come not at the ranch, but at the very heart of the investigation itself. At 3:47 a.m., the Blackwater County Sheriff's Department building's silent alarm was triggered. The responding deputy found no signs of forced entry, but someone had been inside Mitchell's office. A new note was left on her desk along with a detailed map marking the locations of 7 additional cave prisons scattered across a 100-mile radius. The note was brief, but chilling. Since you insist on playing this game, Sheriff, let me show you the full scope of your failure. 7 sacred preparation chambers await your discovery. Some are occupied, others wait for the next chosen ones. Find them quickly, or their contents will join the monuments. You have 72 hours. The break-in at the Sheriff's Department marked a dangerous escalation that transformed the investigation from a serial killer case into a race against time. Mitchell called in every available resource: state police, FBI, tactical teams, and search and rescue units from 3 counties to begin the systematic search of the 7 locations marked on the killer's map. The first cave was discovered 6 hours after the 72-hour deadline began, hidden beneath a camouflaged entrance on abandoned mining property near the town of Malta. Inside, search teams found Dr. Kevin Park, a hydrologist from Montana State University, who had been reported missing 4 days earlier while conducting groundwater studies. Like Patricia Vance, he was alive, but severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure. Dr. Park's account provided additional insight into the killer's methods and escalating timeline. He told me I was part of an accelerated schedule. Park whispered, to Mitchell during his initial interview at the hospital. Said the investigation was forcing him to complete what he called the current cycle more quickly than planned. Did he say how many others were being held? 3 more, he thought. Maybe 4. Sheriff, he wasn't just keeping us alive. He was studying us, taking notes about our responses to isolation, our psychological breaking points, like we were testy subjects. The search for the remaining caves became increasingly urgent as teams worked around the clock to cover the vast territory marked on the killer's map. The second location, found 18 hours into the deadline, was empty, but showed signs of recent occupation. Forensic evidence suggested someone had been held there within the past week. The third cave, discovered in a remote section of the Little Belt Mountains, contained the remains of Angela Rodriguez, a forest ranger who had disappeared 3 months earlier during a routine patrol. Unlike the previous monument sites, these remains had not been arranged in the careful stone circles. They showed evidence of hasty burial, suggesting the killer's timeline was indeed being compressed by the investigation's pressure. He's losing control of his ritual, Agent Rodriguez observed as crime scene technicians processed the burial site. The elaborate arrangements, the careful positioning, that's being abandoned in favor of simple disposal. Mitchell studied the map, noting the geographic distribution of the cave sites. He's been working from south to north, following a pattern based on seasonal access routes. If that holds, the remaining caves should be in the higher elevations. The fourth cave was found at dawn on the second day, carved into a limestone cliff face overlooking the Judith River. Inside was Michael Torres, the ranch hand, whose disappearance had initially been attributed to a simple case of a drifter moving on to new work. Torres had been held captive for nearly a week and was in critical condition when found. 4 caves down, 3 to go, Chen reported as medical teams evacuated Torres. But Sheriff, we're running out of time. If there are other victims in the remaining caves, they might not survive much longer. The psychological pressure of the deadline was affecting everyone involved in the search. Teams worked in rotating shifts, using helicopter support when weather permitted, and ground units when terrain made aerial search impossible. The killer's 72-hour timeline wasn't just about the victims. It was psychological warfare designed to exhaust and demoralize the law enforcement response. The 5th cave, discovered 36 hours into the deadline, was located beneath an abandoned homestead near the Canadian border. It was empty, but evidence suggested it had been prepared recently. Fresh tool marks in the stone walls and newly installed restraint anchors indicated the killer had been expanding his operations even as the investigation closed in. He's been busy, Dr. Reeves observed as he examined the cave's modifications. These improvements were made within the past month, possibly the past week. He's not just maintaining existing sites, he's building new ones. The realization that the killer was expanding his operations while evading a massive manhunt was sobering. It suggested someone with remarkable confidence, detailed knowledge of law enforcement capabilities, and access to resources that allowed him to work undetected across a wide geographic area. The 6th cave was found with only 18 hours remaining in the deadline, hidden beneath a natural rock bridge in a remote canyon. Inside, search teams made a discovery that revealed the true scope of the killer's operations. A sophisticated workshop, equipped with stone-cutting tools, restraint devices, and most disturbingly, a collection of detailed topographic maps covering 4 states marked with hundreds of potential victim locations and suitable cave sites. This isn't just random killing, Mitchell realized as she studied the maps. He's been conducting a systematic survey of the entire region, identifying optimal locations for his operations and cataloging potential victims by their work patterns and isolation levels. Among the materials found in the workshop was a detailed dossier on Patricia Vance, including photographs taken over several months, copies of her work schedules, and maps of her previous survey locations. Similar files existed for Marcus Webb, Dr. Park, and dozens of other individuals who worked alone in remote areas. Jesus Christ, Chen breathed as she flipped through the files. He's been stalking people for months before taking them. This is systematic predation on a scale we never imagined. The workshop also contains something that would prove crucial to identifying the killer. A collection of professional business cards from various print shops, including the one used to create the fictitious Robert Hansen geological consultant identity. One of the cards was from Alpine Printing in Billings, with a handwritten note on the back. JB, usual order ready Thursday. Chen immediately contacted Alpine Printing, speaking with the owner, who remembered the customer well. John Brennan comes in about once a month, the printer told her. Always pays cash, always orders small quantities of business cards with different names and occupations. Seemed like a nice enough guy. Said he was a freelance consultant who worked under various company names. The name John Brennan matched vehicle. Registration records for a dark blue Ford pickup with a distinctive rear quarter panel damage Patricia Vance had described. More importantly, employment records showed John Brennan worked as a geological technician for the U.S. Geological Survey, giving him legitimate access to remote areas across multiple states and detailed knowledge of the underground geology that made his cave modifications possible. USGS employment explains everything, Agent Rodriguez concluded as they reviewed Brennan's background. He travels constantly for legitimate geological surveys, has access to detailed topographic maps, and his job requires him to work in exactly the kind of remote areas where he's been operating. Mitchell felt a cold satisfaction as the pieces finally fell into place, and USGS personnel have emergency radio equipment explaining how he could monitor our communications. Sarah, what's Brennan's current work assignment? Chen was already on the phone with USGS headquarters in Denver. After a tense 15-minute conversation with federal personnel managers, she had the information that would end the case. Sheriff Brennan called in sick 3 days ago and hasn't reported to his assigned project site near Glacier National Park. His supervisor tried to reach him this morning but got no response. Home address? Rural route outside Livingston, about 40 miles from here. Sheriff, there's something else. USGS reports that Brennan has been requesting unusual amounts of geological survey data for areas outside his assigned projects. His supervisor noticed, but didn't think much of it until today. The final cave was almost certainly at Brennan's property, and the 72-hour deadline was now less than 6 hours away. Mitchell coordinated with FBI tactical teams for a high-risk warrant service, knowing that Brennan would likely be prepared for their arrival and might harm any remaining victims rather than allow them to be rescued. Brennan's property was a 20-acre tract of rough land dominated by limestone outcroppings and scattered pine trees. The modest house showed no signs of recent occupation, but tire tracks indicated recent vehicle activity around a barn located several hundred yards from the main residence. The barn had been converted into a workshop similar to the one found in the sixth cave, containing stone cutting equipment, detailed maps, and most chillingly, a bank of monitors showing video feeds from hidden cameras installed in all 7 cave locations. Brennan had been watching the entire search operation, monitoring law enforcement's progress in real time. Sheriff, over here, Agent Rodriguez called from behind the barn. There's a concealed entrance recently used. The entrance led to a natural cave system that had been extensively modified, creating a complex of chambers connected by improved passages. The 7th cave was at the center of this underground facility, and it was occupied. Dr. Sarah Kim, the geologist who had disappeared in North Dakota 2 years earlier, was alive but in critical condition. Unlike the other recent victims, she had been held continuously for over 18 months, subjected to what appeared to be psychological conditioning, designed to make her accept her eventual fate as one of Brennan's monuments to solitude. He's been using her as a test case, Dr. Reeves concluded after examining Kim's condition, studying the long-term psychological effects of isolation and manipulation. She's been his laboratory subject for perfecting the process. As medical teams evacuated Dr. Kim, tactical units continued, searching the cave complex for Brennan himself. They found him in a hidden chamber that served as his living quarters, surrounded by detailed journals documenting his crimes and philosophical treatises justifying his actions as necessary maintenance of the region's spiritual balance. John Brennan, 47 years old and a 15-year veteran of the U.S. Geological Survey, had killed at least 19 people across 6 states over a decade-long period. His journals revealed a profound psychological break that had developed gradually, beginning with legitimate geological work and evolving into a delusional belief that isolated landscapes required human sacrifice to maintain their essential character. "I am the keeper of silent acres," Brennan stated calmly during his initial interrogation. "The empty spaces of this region called to me, demanded guardians to preserve their integrity against the encroachment of false civilization. My chosen ones understood eventually that their sacrifice served a purpose greater than their temporary individual existence." The interrogation revealed the full scope of Brennan's operations. He had been systematically identifying potential victims through his legitimate USGS work, studying their patterns and isolation habits, then abducting them when conditions were optimal. The elaborate stone circle arrangements weren't just ritual behavior. They served as markers for underground chambers where he intended to expand his operations. "Each monument marks a sacred site," Brennan explained with the calm certainty of complete delusion. The caves below were preparation chambers where the chosen ones learned to embrace their transition from temporal flesh to permanent guardians of the silence. The process was compassionate, necessary, and eternal. Most disturbing was Brennan's matter-of-fact description of his selection criteria. He had targeted people whose work required them to spend extended periods alone in remote areas, believing they were already psychologically prepared for the ultimate solitude he offered them. His USGS position provided perfect cover for surveillance and approach, since his presence in remote areas was not only normal, but expected. The case concluded with Brennan's conviction on 19 counts of first-degree murder across multiple federal jurisdictions. The complexity of the charges, spanning 6 states and involving federal lands, required coordination between multiple prosecutors' offices and resulted in a death sentence under federal law. For Sheriff Mitchell, the resolution of the case brought closure, but also lasting changes to how rural law enforcement approached missing person cases. The investigation had revealed how effectively a serial killer could operate across vast rural territories, using legitimate employment as cover and exploiting the isolation that defined life in America's empty spaces. The scary thing isn't that he was crazy. Mitchell reflected during a debriefing session with FBI behavioral specialists. It's how rational his methods were. If Patricia Vance hadn't been found when she was, if that drought hadn't exposed Marcus Webb's remains at just the right time, Brennan could have continued operating indefinitely. The victims' families were able to achieve some measure of closure with remains finally identified and returned for proper burial. Patricia Vance and Dr. Park recovered fully from their orals, though both required extensive psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of their captivity. Dr. Sarah Kim's case was more complex. Her extended captivity had resulted in severe psychological conditioning that required years of treatment. However, her survival and eventual recovery became a testament to human resilience and the possibility of healing, even after prolonged exposure to systematic psychological manipulation. The cave sites were sealed by federal authorities, their locations classified to prevent them from becoming macabre tourist attractions. The stone circle monuments were dismantled. The imported granite returned to quarries when possible. The silent acres that Brennan had claimed to protect were restored to their natural state, free from the twisted guardianship he had imposed upon them. In the years following the case, Sheriff Mitchell implemented new protocols for missing person investigations in rural areas, emphasizing the importance of rapid response and interagency coordination. She also became an advocate for better support resources for law enforcement officers dealing with serial crime cases, recognizing the psychological toll such investigations place on everyone involved. The case of the Keeper of Silent Acres stands as a reminder that evil can flourish in the isolated spaces that define much of rural America. But it also demonstrates that patient, methodical law enforcement work can ultimately bring justice even to the most remote corners of the landscape. The empty spaces that Brennan had claimed as his domain remain what they have always been. Not sacred sites demanding sacrifice, but simply the beautiful, challenging terrain where people choose to work and live despite the inherent risks of isolation. The silence of those vast spaces speaks not of spiritual guardianship or ritual sacrifice, but of the enduring strength of communities that refuse to let fear drive them from the landscapes they call home. In the end, it was not solitude that triumphed, but the connected efforts of law enforcement professionals who refused to let a killer's delusions go unchallenged, Sheriff Mitchell continued to serve Blackwater County until her retirement in 2024, carrying with her the knowledge that vigilance and community cooperation remain the best defenses against those who would exploit the isolation of rural life for evil purposes. The case files were archived, the evidence secured, but the lessons learned became part of the institutional knowledge that protects the vast, beautiful, and occasionally dangerous spaces where silence is not emptiness, but simply the absence of unnecessary noise in landscapes vast enough to contain both solitude and safety, for those wise enough to navigate them with appropriate caution and respect. Sheriff Rebecca Torres had always believed that small-town politics were predictably dirty. Petty corruption involving zoning variances, contract kickbacks, and the occasional campaign finance violation. After 12 years serving Washington County, Idaho, she thought she'd seen every form of municipal graft that could flourish in a community of 8,400 residents, nestled in the timber country 40 miles southeast of K-Deline. But nothing in her experience prepared her for what began to unravel on a rain-soaked November evening in 2020, when a late-night traffic stop would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of county government and involved crimes that made simple corruption look like playground mischief. The call came in at 11:42 p.m. on November 8th, election night, as Torres was driving home after what had been a surprisingly quiet evening. Despite contentious local races, including a heated county commissioner contest, the voting had proceeded without incident. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began in earnest, turning Copper Falls Main Street into a river of reflected neon from the handful of businesses still open. Deputy Marcus Reed's voice crackled over the radio with routine professionalism that masked an undercurrent of tension. "Sheriff, I've got a traffic stop on Highway 95, mile marker 23. Single vehicle, erratic driving. Driver appears intoxicated, but there's something else here you might want to see." "What kind of something else, Marcus?" Torres asked, making a U-turn to head toward Reed's location. At 51, she developed an instinct for reading her deputies' voices, and something in Reed's tone suggested this wasn't a standard DUI stop. Driver is David Kellerman. He's got what looks like a substantial amount of cash visible in the vehicle, and he's talking a lot about things that might be of interest. Torres felt her pulse quicken. David Kellerman was Copper Falls incumbent mayor and a candidate for county commissioner in the election that had concluded just hours earlier. A man known for his careful public image and measured statements wasn't someone who typically found himself drunk and talking too much during traffic stops. "Man," Torres replied. "Don't let him go anywhere until I arrive." Highway 95 cut through dense timber country between Copper Falls and the county seat of Millfield, a stretch of two-lane blacktop that saw little traffic after dark. Torres found Reed's patrol vehicle parked behind a late-model BMW sedan, both cars' emergency lights creating a surreal light show against the rain and surrounding forest. Kellerman was sitting in the back of Reed's cruiser, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his face flushed with alcohol and what appeared to be extreme stress. Through the rain-streaked windows, Torres could see him gesticulating wildly as he spoke to Reed. "What's his condition?" Torres asked as she approached her deputy. Reed, a 7-year veteran who transferred from Boise PD, kept his voice low. "Blood alcohol is probably 0. 15, maybe higher. But Sheriff, he's not just drunk, he's panicked about something. Says he needs protection, that they're going to kill him if they find out what he knows." "Did he say who they are?" "That's where it gets interesting. He mentioned Commissioner Hartwell, Chief Deputy Franklin, and someone he called the Seattle Money." "Sheriff, he's also got about $40,000 in cash in his car, bundled in bank wrappers." Torres felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came with cases that were about to become complicated. Commissioner James Hartwell was the senior member of the county's 3-person governing board, a man who'd held office for 16 years and wielded considerable influence over county contracts and development projects. Chief Deputy Franklin was her own second-in-command, a 20-year veteran she'd inherited when she won the sheriff's election 8 years earlier. "Marcus, I want you to secure the vehicle and all its contents, full inventory, photographs, the works. I'll handle Kellerman personally." The interview with David Kellerman began in the back of Reed's patrol car and continued at the county jail. where Torres had him processed for DUI, while she decided how to handle his increasingly explosive accusations. By 2:00 a.m., with Kellerman sobered up enough to speak coherently, but still frightened enough to talk freely, Torres had heard allegations that made her question everything she thought she knew about county government. "Sheriff, you don't understand," Kellerman said, his hands shaking as he accepted a cup of coffee in the jail's interview room. "The highway expansion project, the new industrial park, the timber sales, it's all connected. There's been a coordinated effort to manipulate county contracts for the past 4 years, involving millions of dollars in fraudulent bidding and kickbacks." Torres leaned forward, studying Kellerman's face for signs of deception or continued intoxication. "Those are serious allegations, David. Do you have evidence to support them? That's why I was driving tonight. I was supposed to deliver that money to a safe deposit box in Spokane before the banks open tomorrow. It's partial payment for my cooperation in rigging the highway expansion bids." Kellerman's voice dropped to a whisper. "But the election results changed everything. If I lose the commissioner race, I become a liability instead of an asset." The highway expansion project was a $12 million federal and state-funded initiative to widen 15 mi of Highway 95 through Washington County, with construction contracts that had been awarded 18 months earlier. Torres remembered the project's announcement. It had been hailed as a major economic development victory that would bring jobs and improve transportation infrastructure. "Who else is involved in this alleged conspiracy?" Torres asked. Kellerman's response would haunt her for months to come. "Sheriff, you need to understand this isn't just about construction contracts. We're talking about a systematic corruption network that includes county commissioners, department heads, and outside developers with connections to organized crime figures in Seattle. The money I was carrying tonight is just a small part of what's been moving through Washington County. My chief deputy, what's his role in this? Franklin has been coordinating with certain commissioners to ensure that law enforcement doesn't look too closely at contract awards, zoning decisions, and permit processes. He's also been providing advanced warning when anyone starts asking uncomfortable questions." Torres felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. If Kellerman's allegations were true, it meant corruption had penetrated her own department while she remained completely unaware. "Do you have documentation, financial records, communications, anything that proves these claims?" "Some. But the smart money, the people really running this operation, they're careful about leaving trails. Most of the evidence exists in offshore accounts, encrypted communications, and arrangements that are designed to look legitimate on paper." The interview continued until dawn, with Kellerman providing details about fraudulent bidding processes, phantom consulting companies, and a complex money-laundering operation that used legitimate county business to hide millions of dollars in illegal profits. Most disturbing was his description of how the conspiracy had evolved from simple kickback schemes into something approaching organized criminal enterprise. "It started small," Kellerman explained, as exhaustion began to show in his voice. "Hartwell needed campaign money, so he started steering small contracts to companies that would make donations. But then the Seattle money showed up. People with connections to construction and development interests that aren't entirely legal. Once that happened, the whole thing grew beyond local politics into something much more dangerous." Torres released Kellerman on his own recognizance after charging him with DUI, but she kept the $40,000 in cash as evidence pending further investigation. As she watched him leave the jail that morning, she realized she faced a dilemma that could define not only her career, but the future of law enforcement in Washington County. If Kellerman's allegations were true, she was looking at a corruption investigation that implicated her own chief deputy and potentially other members of her department. More troubling was the possibility that outside criminal interests had gained influence over local government, using Washington County as a base for operations that extended far beyond simple municipal corruption. "Marcus," she told Deputy Reed as they prepared to go off shift, "I want you to keep this entire incident confidential for now. Don't discuss it with anyone in the department and don't put anything in the regular report system. Sheriff, are you worried about internal security?" "I'm worried about everything," Torres replied honestly. "If even half of what Kellerman told us is true, we're dealing with a conspiracy that could include people we work with every day. The next 48 hours were among the most difficult of Torres' law enforcement career. She found herself studying her colleagues' behavior for signs of deception, questioning routine interactions that had never seemed suspicious before, and struggling to maintain normal operations while internally conducting surveillance on her own department. Chief Deputy Franklin's demeanor provided the first confirmation that Kellerman's allegations might have substance. A normally gregarious man who took pride in keeping Torres informed about all significant departmental activities, Franklin became noticeably evasive when she asked routine questions about recent investigations and pending cases. "Sheriff, is there something specific you're concerned about?" Franklin asked during their regular Wednesday morning briefing, his tone carrying unusual defensiveness. "Just maintaining situational awareness, Pete," Torres replied, watching his reaction carefully. "With the election results still being finalized and some tight races, I want to make sure we're prepared for any challenges or complaints." Franklin's response was telling in its specificity. "The Kellerman DUI from Monday night, that's not going to create any political complications, is it?" He's been a good supporter of the department over the years. Torres had not mentioned the Kellerman incident to Franklin, which meant he'd learned about it through other channels. In a small department, news traveled quickly, but Franklin's immediate concern about political complications suggested he understood there was more to the traffic stop than a simple drunk driving arrest. "Why would a routine DUI create political complications?" Torres asked, just concerned about appearances. "Sheriff, you know how these things can get blown out of proportion during election season." The conversation convinced Torres that Franklin was either directly involved in whatever Kellerman had described, or at minimum aware that sensitive activities were taking place within the county government. Either possibility meant she could no longer trust her own second-in-command. That afternoon, Torres made a decision that violated every principle of departmental hierarchy and internal communication. Instead of pursuing the investigation through normal channels, she began conducting covert inquiries using only Deputy Reed and one other officer. She felt confident hadn't been compromised. "Marcus, I need you to run some background checks, but I want you to do it quietly and off the official system," she told Reed during a private meeting at her home that evening. "I want complete financial and business records for Commissioner Hartwell, Chief Deputy Franklin, and anyone else connected to the highway expansion project." "Sheriff, are we talking about an internal affairs investigation?" "We're talking about potential criminal conspiracy that may involve members of our own department. Until we understand the scope of what we're dealing with, we treat everyone as potentially compromised." Reed's investigation, conducted over the following week, using resources from the state police and federal databases that wouldn't trigger local notifications, revealed a pattern of financial activity that supported Kellerman's allegations. Commissioner Hartwell had received substantial campaign contributions from companies that were later awarded county contracts, often at prices significantly above competitive bids. More disturbing was Chief Deputy Franklin's financial history. Bank records showed large cash deposits that coincided with major county contract awards, deposits that couldn't be explained by his official salary or any known legitimate income sources. "Sheriff, look at this," Reed said as they reviewed the financial data in Torres' home office. "Franklin's been making cash deposits of $5,000 to $10,000 every few months for the past 3 years, always in amounts just below federal reporting requirements. What about the contractors themselves? Any connections to outside criminal interest?" That's where it gets interesting. 3 of the major companies that won highway expansion contracts are subsidiaries of a Seattle-based development firm called Pacific Northwest Holdings. Corporate records show the parent company has been investigated by federal authorities for ties to organized crime, though no charges were ever filed. Torres studied the corporate structure charts Reed had assembled, noting the complex web of subsidiaries and holding companies that obscured the true ownership of the contracting firms. This isn't just local corruption. This is money laundering and organized criminal activity using Washington County government as a front. The breakthrough in understanding the full scope of the conspiracy came from an unexpected source. Elena Vasquez, a bookkeeper for the county auditor's office, contacted Torres directly with information that confirmed and expanded upon Kellerman's allegations. "Sheriff, I've been keeping copies of financial records that document fraudulent transactions. Vasquez explained during a clandestine meeting at a truck stop outside county boundaries. I was afraid to come forward before because I wasn't sure who could be trusted, but after the election results, I think certain people are going to try to destroy evidence. Vasquez had spent 2 years documenting irregular financial activities, including contract payments to companies that existed only on paper, consulting fees for services that were never provided, and complex accounting manipulations that diverted federal highway funds into private accounts. The highway expansion project was just the beginning, Vasquez continued. They've been using the same methods to steal money from the timber sales program, the industrial park development, and federal grants for rural infrastructure improvements. We're talking about at least $8 million in fraudulent transactions over the past 4 years. Who else in the county government is involved? Commissioner Hartwell is the leader, but he's been working with Deputy Franklin and at least 3 other department heads. They've created what amounts to a shadow government that operates parallel to the official county structure. The evidence Vasquez provided included detailed financial records, recorded phone conversations, and copies of communications between county officials and representatives of Pacific Northwest Holdings. Most damaging was a series of emails discussing the need to maintain law enforcement cooperation and ensuring that local investigations are properly managed. Elena, this level of documentation. How were you able to compile all this without being detected? Because they see bookkeepers as invisible, she replied with bitter satisfaction. They discuss everything in front of me like I'm not there. Leave documents on my desk to process without reading them carefully, and assume I don't understand the implications of what I'm recording in the official books. Torres realized she was now in possession of evidence that could bring down not only a local corruption network, but potentially implicate organized crime figures operating across state lines. The scope of the investigation had grown beyond what her small department could handle, but she also knew that involving federal authorities would create risks for both her witnesses and her own safety. Elena, I need you to understand. If we move forward with this, everyone involved is going to be in danger. These aren't just corrupt politicians we're dealing with. If there really are organized crime connections, they won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Sheriff, I've been living in fear for 2 years, watching them steal money that should be going to schools, roads, and public safety. If I don't speak up now, I'll be complicit in their crimes. That night, Torres made the most difficult decision of her law enforcement career. She contacted Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Seattle field office, requesting a confidential meeting to discuss evidence of organized criminal activity in Washington County. The call would set in motion events that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated municipal corruption schemes in Idaho's history, but it would also place Torres and her family in mortal danger from people who had already demonstrated they would kill to protect their criminal enterprise. As she prepared for the meeting with federal agents, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The investigation had begun with a simple DUI arrest, but it was evolving into something that could destroy not only the corrupt officials but potentially the entire structure of local government in Washington County. 3 days later, as Torres drove to her meeting with the FBI, she noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be following her route. When she deliberately took several unnecessary turns, the sedan maintained its distance but continued to follow. By the time she reached the designated meeting location, a rest area on Interstate 90 near the Washington border, she was certain she was under surveillance. The realization that her investigation had been detected by the very people she was investigating marked the beginning of a deadly game of cat and mouse that would test every skill she'd developed as a law enforcement officer. Somewhere in the network of corruption that had infected Washington County government, someone had decided that Sheriff Rebecca Torres had become too dangerous to ignore. As she walked toward the federal agents waiting in the rest area, Torres knew that her next decisions would determine not only whether justice would be served, but whether she would survive long enough to see the corrupt officials brought to trial. The quiet corruption of small-town politics had evolved into something far more deadly, and Torres found herself at the center of a conspiracy that would ultimately reach from the timber forests of northern Idaho to the organized crime families of the Pacific Northwest. The meeting with Agent Jen was brief but intense. After reviewing the evidence Torres and Vasquez had compiled, the federal agent made a decision that would change everything. "Sheriff Torres, what you've uncovered appears to be a RICO-level criminal enterprise," Chen said as they studied the financial documents in her car. "We're going to need to move quickly because if your investigation has been detected, the subjects are likely destroying evidence and potentially planning to eliminate witnesses. What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "We implement a joint federal-local operation within 72 hours or we risk losing everything." "But Sheriff, you need to understand. Once we move, there's no going back. This investigation is going to destroy the existing power structure in your county, and the people we're targeting have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their interests." Torres looked out at the Idaho landscape, the familiar forests and mountains that had been home for most of her life. In 3 days, everything would change. The corruption that had infected Washington County like a cancer would be exposed. But the process would also reveal just how far certain people were willing to go to protect $8 million in stolen money and the criminal network that had made it possible. As she drove back toward Copper Falls, Torres didn't notice the dark sedan that had followed her to the meeting was now joined by a second vehicle. The surveillance network that had been watching her movements was expanding. And somewhere in the complex hierarchy of the criminal organization she'd uncovered, someone was making plans to ensure that Sheriff Rebecca Torres would not live to testify about what she'd discovered. The countdown to the joint federal-local operation had begun, but Torres was about to learn that her enemies had their own timeline, one that didn't include allowing her or her witnesses to survive the next 48 hours. The attempt on Sheriff Torres's life came 36 hours after her meeting with the FBI, delivered with the professional efficiency that characterized every aspect of the criminal organization she'd been investigating. She was driving home from the department on Thursday evening when the brake line on her patrol vehicle failed completely as she descended the winding mountain road that led to her house. Only years of emergency vehicle operation training and pure luck allowed her to guide the cruiser into a roadside ditch instead of over the cliff that bordered the highway's eastern edge. As Torres climbed out of the wrecked vehicle, shaken but uninjured, she knew the mechanical failure wasn't accidental. The brake line had been severed with surgical precision, designed to fail at the worst possible moment on the most dangerous section of her regular route home. Someone with detailed knowledge of her daily patterns had attempted to eliminate her in a way that would appear to be a tragic accident. Deputy Reed arrived at the crash scene within minutes, having been monitoring radio traffic and recognizing that Torres was overdue for her regular end-of-shift check-in. As he examined the patrol vehicle, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Sheriff, this was sabotage," Reed confirmed, pointing to the cleanly cut brake line hidden beneath the vehicle. "Whoever did this knew exactly how to disable the brakes, without creating obvious evidence of tampering." Torres felt a cold certainty settle over her as she realized the full implications. "Marcus, this means someone in the department is feeding information to the conspiracy. Only department personnel have regular access to our vehicles, and only someone with mechanical knowledge would know how to create this kind of failure. Chief Deputy Franklin, possibly, but it could be anyone with access to the motor pool and knowledge of my schedule. From this point forward, we assume the entire department has been compromised." The failed assassination attempt marked a dramatic escalation that forced Torres to accelerate her timeline with federal authorities. Within hours of the crash, she was in secure communication with Agent Chen, coordinating an emergency operation that would begin the following morning. "Sheriff, the attempt on your life confirms that this criminal organization will kill to protect their operation," Chen told her during an encrypted phone call. "We're implementing immediate witness protection protocols and moving the joint operation forward by 24 hours. What about Ellen Vasquez? If they're targeting me, she's also in danger. We're bringing her into federal protection tonight. But Sheriff, there's something else you need to know. Our surveillance of county government communications has intercepted discussions about eliminating multiple witnesses, including David Kellerman." Torres felt her stomach drop. Despite his involvement in the corruption, Kellerman had provided crucial evidence and didn't deserve to die for his cooperation. Where is he now? Unknown. He failed to report to his attorney this morning and hasn't been seen since yesterday evening. We have agents searching for him, but given the timeline, we may be too late. The realization that the conspiracy was moving to eliminate witnesses meant Torres had to choose between her own safety and protecting the people who had risked everything to expose the truth. Against FBI advice, she decided to return to Copper Falls that night to personally ensure that key witnesses were protected. "Marcus, I need you to do something that's going to test your loyalty to this department," Torres told Deputy Reed as they prepared for what might be their final shift together. "I'm going to ask you to help me arrest our own chief deputy and potentially other officers who have been compromised." Reed's response came without hesitation. "Sheriff, I swore an oath to uphold the law, not to protect corrupt cops. What do you need me to do?" The plan Torres developed was simple but dangerous. Using the excuse of conducting a department-wide equipment inventory, she would call all personnel to the station Friday morning, then systematically isolate and arrest those involved in the conspiracy. While federal agents secured evidence from county government offices. But first, she needed to find David Kellerman before the criminal organization could eliminate him permanently. Kellerman's disappearance had been carefully orchestrated to look like a man fleeing from pending criminal charges. But Torres suspected he was being held somewhere until the conspiracy could determine how much damage his cooperation with law enforcement might cause. Using his cell phone GPS data obtained through federal warrants, Agent Chen's team tracked Kellerman's last known location to an abandoned logging camp 25 miles northeast of Copper Falls. Torres and Reed approached the logging camp at dawn, supported by a team of federal agents who had infiltrated the area during the night. The remote location was perfect for hiding someone temporarily or permanently disposing of a body where it might never be found. They found Kellerman in a storage building that had been converted into a makeshift prison, alive, but showing signs of severe physical abuse. His captors had been systematically torturing him for information about what evidence he had provided to law enforcement and what other witnesses might be able to testify against the conspiracy. Sheriff Kellerman whispered through swollen lips as Torres freed him from his restraints. "They know everything. They know about Elena, about your federal contacts, about the planned operation. Someone's been feeding them real-time intelligence about your investigation. Who's holding you here?" "Chief Deputy Franklin and 2 men from Seattle. They've been taking turns questioning me for the past 2 days. Sheriff, they're planning to kill everyone connected to the investigation, including you." Franklin said the federal operation would be stopped before it could begin. Torres felt the investigation's timeline collapsing around her. If Franklin knew about the planned federal operation, it meant the conspiracy had intelligence sources beyond the local level, possibly within federal law enforcement itself, or sophisticated enough surveillance capabilities to monitor supposedly secure communications. "Marcus, get Kellerman to the federal agents for immediate evacuation," Torres ordered. "I'm going back to town to warn Elena and implement emergency protocols." "Sheriff, if they know about the federal operation, going back to Copper Falls is suicide. Then we change the operation's parameters. Instead of a coordinated federal-local action, we make this a pure federal operation with local support. But first, I need to save my witnesses." The drive back to Copper Falls was the longest 25 miles of Torres' career. She knew that by rescuing Kellerman, she had alerted the conspiracy to the fact that their intelligence had been compromised. They would now move to eliminate all evidence and witnesses immediately, rather than following their original timeline. Torres arrived at Elena Vasquez's home to find FBI agents already in the process of evacuating her to federal protection. But the evacuation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 vehicles carrying what appeared to be county sheriff's deputies. Men Torres didn't recognize, but who wore official uniforms and displayed authentical-looking credentials. "Sheriff Torres, we're here to provide additional security for the witness relocation," announced the lead man, whose voice carried a slight accent that didn't match his claimed local affiliation. Agent Chen emerged from Vasquez's house, her hand resting on her weapon as she studied the newcomers. "Sheriff, these men aren't on the approved personnel list for this operation." The standoff lasted only seconds before the fake deputies revealed their true intentions by drawing weapons. The resulting gunfight in Elena Vasquez's front yard marked the point at which the Washington County corruption investigation became a federal organized crime operation involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the fake deputies were dead, and the third was in federal custody. Their identities would later confirm Torres' worst fears. They were professional criminals with ties to Seattle organized crime families, brought in specifically to eliminate witnesses in the corruption case. "Sheriff, this conspiracy has resources and connections we didn't anticipate," Agent Chen told Torres as federal tactical teams secured the scene. "We're dealing with people who can field professional assassins and counterfeit law enforcement credentials. This isn't just local corruption anymore. It's an organized criminal enterprise with national implications." The revelation that organized crime figures were willing to deploy professional killers to protect a municipal corruption scheme fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. Federal authorities upgraded the case to a full RICO prosecution, bringing in resources from multiple agencies and implementing security measures normally reserved for cases involving international criminal organizations. But for Torres, the immediate concern was protecting her community from a criminal network that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill law enforcement officers and civilians alike. The corruption that had begun with simple kickback schemes had evolved into something that threatened the basic safety of everyone in Washington County. "Agent Chen, I want to know exactly how deep this conspiracy goes," Torres said as they coordinated the expanded federal operation. "If Chief Deputy Franklin has been providing intelligence to organized crime figures, we need to assume that every aspect of county government has been compromised." The federal investigation that followed would ultimately reveal the most sophisticated municipal corruption scheme in Idaho's history. Using advanced surveillance techniques and financial analysis, agents documented a criminal network that had systematically looted county resources while establishing Washington County as a base for organized crime operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Commissioner Hartwell's role went far beyond simple kickback schemes. He had been working directly with Seattle crime families to establish money laundering operations using county government as a front, processing millions of dollars in illegal profits through legitimate municipal contracts and development projects. Chief Deputy Franklin's involvement was even more disturbing. He had been providing organized crime figures with intelligence about federal law enforcement activities, witness identities, and planned investigations. His access to law enforcement databases and communication systems had allowed the criminal organization to stay ahead of multiple investigations for years. "Sheriff, look at this," Agent Chen said as they reviewed intercepted communications between Franklin and his organized crime contacts. "He's been selling information about federal investigations across 3 states. Your corruption case isn't the only one he's been sabotaging." The scope of the criminal network's activities stunned even experienced federal investigators. Beyond the local corruption, they had been using Washington County as a staging area for drug trafficking operations, illegal gambling enterprises, and sophisticated money laundering schemes that moved criminal profits across international borders. Most troubling was the discovery that the conspiracy had infiltrated law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions. Franklin's communication records revealed contacts with compromised officers in at least 6 different departments, creating a network of criminal intelligence that had allowed organized crime to operate with near impunity across the region. This explains how they've been avoiding prosecution for so long, Torres realized as she studied the communication intercepts. They've had advanced warning of every investigation, every warrant, every planned operation. We've been fighting a criminal organization that knew our moves before we made them. The arrests began at dawn on Saturday morning, coordinated across multiple states by federal agents who had spent the night positioning themselves near the homes and offices of everyone involved in the conspiracy. The scope of the operation required over 200 federal agents and state police officers, making it one of the largest law enforcement operations in Idaho's history. Commissioner Hartwell was arrested at his home as he attempted to flee with suitcases containing cash and financial documents. Chief Deputy Franklin was taken into custody at the Sheriff's Department, where he had been destroying evidence in violation of federal preservation orders. In total, 14 individuals were arrested on charges ranging from bribery and conspiracy to racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. For Torres, watching her own chief deputy led away in handcuffs was both a vindication of her investigation and a devastating blow to her faith in the institution she had served for over a decade. The corruption had penetrated so deeply into the department that she would need to rebuild the entire command structure from scratch. "Sheriff, we've recovered over $3 million in cash and assets from the immediate arrests," Agent Chen reported as the operation continued, but the financial analysis suggests the total amount stolen from Washington County exceeds $12 million over the past 6 years. How much of that can be recovered? Unknown. Much of the money has been moved through offshore accounts and legitimate investments that will take years to trace. The organized crime figures behind this operation are sophisticated enough to insulate most of their profits from law enforcement recovery efforts. The aftermath of the arrests revealed the true scope of how the corruption had affected every aspect of county government. Contracts totaling over $40 million would need to be reviewed for fraud. Zoning decisions involving thousands of acres of development would require reevaluation, and the entire county budget would need forensic auditing to determine how much public money had been stolen. "Sheriff, the federal prosecutor wants to know if you're willing to testify before a federal grand jury about the conspiracy," Agent Chen told Torres as they surveyed the wreckage of what had once been a functioning county government. "Of course, but Agent Chen, what happens to Washington County now? We've just arrested or implicated most of the senior leadership of county government. How do we maintain public services while rebuilding from scratch? That's going to be the challenge. The federal government will provide temporary oversight and assistance, but ultimately the citizens of Washington County will need to elect new leadership and rebuild their institutions." As Torres stood in her office that evening, looking out at the community she had sworn to protect, she realized that exposing the corruption had been only the beginning of a much longer process. The criminal organization had been dismantled, the corrupt officials arrested, and the organized crime connections severed. But the damage to public trust and institutional integrity would take years to repair. The investigation had started with a drunk mayor carrying $40,000 in cash during a traffic stop. It had evolved into a case that exposed organized crime infiltration of local government and ultimately led to one of the largest federal prosecutions in the region's history. But for the citizens of Washington County, the real work was just beginning. The slow, difficult process of rebuilding their government and restoring faith in the institutions that were supposed to serve their interests, rather than enriching criminal organizations. Torres knew that her role in that rebuilding process would be crucial, but she also knew that the enemies they had made were still out there. The organized crime figures behind the conspiracy had lost their local operations, but they still had resources, connections, and reasons to seek revenge against those who had brought their carefully constructed criminal empire crashing down. As she locked her office that night, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that while this battle had been won, the war against organized crime's influence in rural communities was far from over. The conspiracy in Washington County had been exposed and destroyed. But the criminal organizations that had created it were still operating across the Pacific Northwest, looking for new communities to infiltrate and corrupt. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Copper Falls, those organizations were already planning their next moves, learning from their failures in Washington County and adapting their methods to avoid detection in future operations. The price of freedom from corruption, Torres realized, would be eternal vigilance and the willingness to fight battles that most citizens never knew were being waged in their names. The federal grand jury convened in Boise 6 weeks after the arrests, drawing national attention to what prosecutors described as the most extensive municipal corruption case in the modern history of the American West. Sheriff Torres found herself at the center of a legal proceeding that would ultimately reshape how federal authorities approached organized crime infiltration of small-town governments across the country. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal officials, and residents of Washington County, who had come to witness the dismantling of the criminal organization that had stolen millions of dollars from their community. Torres took the witness stand on a cold January morning, knowing that her testimony would not only help convict the conspirators, but also paint a target on her back for any surviving members of the criminal network. Sheriff Torres, Prosecutor Janet Martinez began, "Please tell the grand jury how you first became aware of the conspiracy that has brought us here today." Torres's testimony spanned 3 days, detailing everything from David Kellerman's drunken confession to the discovery of organized crime connections that reached from rural Idaho to Seattle's criminal underworld. Her account of the assassination attempt on her own life sent murmurs through the courtroom and prompted additional security measures for all witnesses. The brake lines on my patrol vehicle were severed with professional precision, Torres explained to the grand jury. This wasn't vandalism or amateur sabotage. It was attempted murder carried out by someone with detailed knowledge of both my daily routines and automotive systems. Chief Deputy Franklin's testimony, delivered under a plea agreement that reduced his potential sentence from life in prison to 25 years, provided the most damaging evidence against the criminal organization's leadership. His detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's operations, combined with his access to law enforcement intelligence, made him the prosecution's most valuable witness. Commissioner Hartwell introduced me to Vincent Torino in 2017. Franklin testified, his voice barely audible as he described his first contact with organized crime figures. Torino represented what he called Seattle investment interests that wanted to develop business opportunities in rural markets. At first, it seemed like legitimate economic development. Franklin's account revealed how gradually he had been drawn into the conspiracy, beginning with simple favors like providing advanced warning of routine investigations and evolving into active participation in murder conspiracies and money laundering operations. By 2019, I was receiving monthly payments of $10,000 for ensuring that certain law enforcement activities were coordinated with the organization's interests, Franklin continued. When Sheriff Torres began investigating the highway expansion contracts, Torino made it clear that her investigation needed to be stopped by any means necessary. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of Elena Vasquez, whose meticulous documentation of financial irregularities provided a paper trail that connected county government corruption to organized crime money laundering. Operations spanning multiple states. The numbers never made sense, Vasquez explained to the grand jury. Consulting fees for services that were never provided, contract payments to companies that existed only on paper, and complex accounting transfers that moved money through dozens of shell corporations. When I started documenting these irregularities, I realized we were looking at systematic theft of public funds. Vasquez's evidence included over 400 pages of financial records, recorded phone conversations, and copies of communications between county officials and organized crime figures. Her documentation proved that the conspiracy had stolen over $14 million from Washington County during its 6-year operation. Most compelling was David Kellerman's testimony about his role in the conspiracy and the organization's escalating violence when faced with exposure. Despite his own criminal culpability, Kellerman's detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's operations and his willingness to admit his crimes provided crucial corroboration for the prosecution's case. They told me that cooperating with law enforcement would result in my family being killed. Kellerman testified, describing the threats that had prompted his initial confession to Torres. Vincent Torino showed me photographs of my children's school, my wife's workplace, and our home. He made it very clear that the organization had the resources to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The grand jury's final report, issued after 6 weeks of testimony, resulted in indictments against 47 individuals across 6 states, including organized crime figures who had never set foot in Washington County, but had orchestrated the conspiracy from their bases in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. Commissioner Hartwell was indicted on 32 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. His trial, which began 8 months later, would become a landmark case in federal prosecution of organized crime infiltration of municipal governments. The evidence presented during Hartwell's trial revealed the sophisticated methods the criminal organization had used to establish and maintain control over Washington County government. Beyond simple bribery and kickbacks, they had implemented systematic surveillance of community leaders, installed monitoring equipment in government buildings, and maintained detailed psychological profiles of county employees to identify potential assets and threats. This wasn't random corruption, Prosecutor Martinez told the jury during opening statements. This was a carefully planned takeover of local government by organized crime figures who saw rural communities as vulnerable targets for large-scale criminal operations. The prosecution's case included surveillance footage showing Hartwell meeting with known organized crime figures, financial records documenting millions of dollars in illegal transactions, and recorded phone conversations in which Hartwell discussed the need to eliminate law enforcement witnesses. Most damning was a recording made by Elena Vasquez during a county commissioners' meeting in which Hartwell openly discussed plans to permanently solve the Sheriff Torres problem and ensure that federal investigations could be managed through appropriate channels. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Hartwell as a victim of organized crime intimidation rather than a willing participant, but the evidence of his active coordination with criminal figures proved overwhelming. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury convicted him on all counts, resulting in a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. The trials of other conspiracy members continued for over 2 years, ultimately resulting in convictions for 39 of the 47 indicted individuals. The sentences ranged from 5 years for minor participants to life imprisonment for organized crime leaders and those involved in murder conspiracies. Vincent Torino, identified as the Seattle-based organized crime figure who had orchestrated the Washington County operation, was convicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. His trial revealed that the Washington County conspiracy had been part of a larger criminal strategy to establish organized crime operations in rural communities across the Pacific Northwest. Mr. Torino and his associates viewed small towns and rural counties as soft targets for criminal infiltration. Federal prosecutor James Wilson explained during sentencing. They believed that limited law enforcement resources and close-knit community relationships would make it easier to corrupt local officials and avoid federal attention. For Sheriff Torres, the successful prosecution of the conspiracy represented both a professional triumph and a personal ordeal that would affect her for the rest of her career. The investigation had cost her the trust of many community members who felt betrayed by the revelation that their government had been controlled by organized crime, and it had made her a permanent target for criminal organizations operating throughout the region. Sheriff Torres' courage in exposing this conspiracy saved Washington County from complete criminal takeover. Agent Chen said during a federal law enforcement ceremony honoring Torres' work. Her investigation prevented organized crime from establishing a permanent foothold in rural Idaho and provided a model for other jurisdictions facing similar threats. The aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure required massive reforms in Washington county government. New oversight procedures were implemented to prevent future corruption. Financial controls were strengthened to detect irregular transactions, and law enforcement protocols were revised to ensure that criminal intelligence couldn't be compromised by corrupt officials. Torres worked with federal authorities to rebuild the sheriff's department from the ground up, implementing background check procedures that included psychological evaluations and financial audits for all personnel. The department size was reduced from 23 deputies to 15, but the remaining officers were thoroughly vetted and provided with additional training in recognizing and reporting corruption. We learned that corruption doesn't announce itself, Torres explained to a gathering of rural law enforcement officials who had come to study Washington County's recovery process. It infiltrates gradually, taking advantage of trust and community relationships to establish influence before revealing its true nature. The financial recovery process proved more challenging than the law enforcement response. While federal authorities were able to seize assets totaling over $8 million from the conspiracy's operations, much of the stolen money had been moved through offshore accounts and legitimate investments that were difficult to trace and recover. Washington County filed civil lawsuits against the bonding companies that had insured the corrupt contracts, ultimately recovering an additional $12 million that was used to fund infrastructure projects and compensate taxpayers for the stolen funds. However, the legal process took over 4 years to complete and required extensive federal assistance. Perhaps most importantly, the Washington County case established legal precedents that enhanced federal authorities' ability to prosecute organized crime infiltration of municipal governments. The investigation techniques developed during Torres' case became standard protocols for similar investigations across the country. The personal cost to Torres and other witnesses was significant and ongoing. Despite the successful prosecutions, organized crime figures who had avoided conviction continued to view the Washington County witnesses as threats to their operations. Torres and her family were relocated under federal witness protection protocols, and Elena Vasquez was permanently relocated to another state under a new identity. David Kellerman, whose cooperation had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy, served 18 months in federal prison under a plea agreement. Upon his release, he was also relocated under witness protection after receiving credible death threats from surviving members of the criminal organization. The people who destroyed this conspiracy deserve to live free from fear, Agent Chen stated during a congressional hearing on organized crime infiltration of rural communities. But the reality is that criminal organizations have long memories and significant resources for revenge operations. 5 years after the initial arrests, Torres continued to serve as sheriff of Washington County while living under enhanced security protocols that included regular threat assessments and coordination with federal protective services. The department she rebuilt had become a model for rural law enforcement agencies dealing with sophisticated criminal threats. We proved that small-town law enforcement can successfully confront organized crime if we're willing to acknowledge the threat and work with federal authorities, Torres told a National Sheriff's Association conference. But we also learned that victory comes with a price that extends far beyond the courtroom. The Washington County conspiracy case became a landmark in federal law enforcement's understanding of how organized crime adapts to target rural communities. The investigation techniques developed during the case were used successfully in similar operations across 12 states, ultimately dismantling criminal networks that had infiltrated dozens of small-town governments. For the residents of Washington County, the exposure and prosecution of the conspiracy represented both vindication and a sobering lesson about the vulnerability of small communities to sophisticated criminal organizations. The rebuilding process required not only new government structures, but also a fundamental reassessment of how rural communities could protect themselves from external criminal threats. We learned that isolation can be both a strength and a vulnerability, explained Dr. Margaret Foster, a political scientist who studied the Washington County case for the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Rural communities. Strong social bonds and trust-based relationships can be exploited by criminal organizations, but they can also provide the foundation for effective resistance to corruption. The economic impact of the conspiracy extended far beyond the direct financial losses. The revelation that county government had been controlled by organized crime damaged Washington County's reputation and deterred legitimate business development for several years. Recovery required extensive public relations efforts and federal assistance to restore investor confidence in the region. Tourism, which had been a growing economic sector, declined sharply after the conspiracy's exposure as potential visitors associated the area with organized crime activity. The county implemented marketing campaigns emphasizing the successful prosecution of the criminals and the reforms that had been implemented to prevent future corruption. We had to prove that Washington County was safe for families and legitimate businesses, explained Jennifer Walsh, the economic development director hired to lead the recovery effort. The criminal organization had been eliminated, but we needed to demonstrate that we had learned from the experience and implemented safeguards to prevent similar infiltration. The educational value of the Washington County case extended internationally, with the law enforcement agencies from several countries studying the investigation techniques and prosecution strategies used to dismantle the conspiracy. The case became a textbook example of how organized crime adapts to exploit rural communities and how effective law enforcement responses can be developed. Torres received numerous awards for her role in exposing the conspiracy, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation Directors Award for Excellence in Law Enforcement and the International Association of Chiefs of Police Award for Professional Excellence. However, she consistently emphasized that the successful outcome required cooperation from brave witnesses and federal authorities rather than individual heroism. This case proves that no community is too small or too remote to be targeted by organized crime, Torres said during her acceptance speech for the FBI Directors Award. But it also proves that dedicated law enforcement officers, brave witnesses, And effective federal cooperation can overcome even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. 10 years after David Kellerman's drunken confession during a routine traffic stop, Washington County had rebuilt its government, restored public trust, and implemented safeguards that made it a model for other rural communities facing similar threats. The conspiracy that had once threatened to turn the county into a permanent base for organized crime operations had been completely dismantled, with its leaders serving life sentences in federal prison. Sheriff Torres continued to serve the community that had been both victim and beneficiary of her investigation. The department she rebuilt operated with transparency and accountability measures that exceeded federal standards, and the county government functioned with oversight procedures that made corruption extremely difficult to establish or maintain. "We paid a high price for learning these lessons," Torres reflected during a ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the conspiracy's exposure. "But we proved that rural communities don't have to accept criminal infiltration as inevitable. With courage, cooperation, and proper support, even small-town law enforcement can confront and defeat organized crime." The Washington County case stands as both a warning about the vulnerability of rural communities to sophisticated criminal infiltration and an inspiration for law enforcement officers facing seemingly impossible odds against well-funded and politically connected criminal organizations. It demonstrates that corruption can be defeated, but only through the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for justice and the support of federal authorities committed to protecting the integrity of American communities regardless of their size or isolation. For Sheriff Rebecca Torres, the investigation that began with a simple DUI arrest became the defining case of her career, and a testament to the principle that no criminal organization, regardless of its resources or political connections, is beyond the reach of determined law enforcement officers committed to protecting their communities from those who would exploit trust for criminal gain. Sheriff Jake Morrison had always understood that people vanish in rural America with disturbing frequency. During his 14 years serving Clearwater County, Wyoming, 2,800 square miles of high desert, mountain ranges, and scattered ranching communities, he'd handled dozens of missing person cases that simply dissolved into the vast landscape without resolution. Drifters who moved on without notice, domestic disputes that ended with someone fleeing to start over elsewhere, and the occasional hiker or hunter who wandered off established trails and never returned. In a county where the nearest neighbor might live 20 minutes away, and cell phone coverage disappeared beyond the main highways, people could vanish as easily as morning mist in the summer sun. But the case that began on a crystalline October morning in 2021 would force Morrison to confront the possibility that Clearwater County's missing persons weren't random disappearances at all. They were systematic abductions carried out by someone who understood the landscape's capacity to swallow people whole and had been exploiting that knowledge for years. The call came in at 7:23 a.m. from Helen Rodriguez, the day manager at the Frontier Motel, a 12-unit establishment that served as Clearwater County's primary accommodation for traveling workers, hunting guides, and the occasional tourist brave enough to venture into Wyoming's emptiest corner. Helen's voice carried the controlled panic of someone trying to remain professional while reporting something that violated every expectation of normal small-town life. "Sheriff Morrison, we've got a situation here at the motel," Helen began, her words measured but tight with stress. "One of our guests, a geologist working for the state, was supposed to check out 3 days ago, but her room's still occupied, and we can't reach her. When maintenance checked the room this morning, well, you need to see this yourself." Morrison was already reaching for his keys and duty belt. In rural law enforcement, any deviation from established patterns warranted immediate attention, and Helen Rodriguez wasn't someone who called authorities without good reason. What exactly did maintenance find Helen? Her belongings are all still here. Clothes, equipment, car keys, even her purse with cash and credit cards. But Dr. Sarah Kim is gone, and Sheriff. The room looks like someone was preparing to stay much longer than originally planned. The Frontier Motel sat along Highway 287, the two-lane blacktop that served as Clearwater County's main transportation corridor, connecting the county seat of Riverside to the ranching communities scattered throughout the region. Morrison had known Helen Rodriguez for 8 years, ever since she'd moved to Wyoming from Colorado to escape an abusive marriage. And he'd never known her to be alarmist or prone to exaggeration. As Morrison drove the 12 miles from Riverside to the motel, he found himself mentally reviewing Clearwater County's recent missing person cases. In the past 18 months, they'd had an unusual number of people who had simply vanished. A hunting guide named Marcus Torres, who disappeared while scouting elk territory. A freelance photographer named Jennifer Walsh, who'd been documenting abandoned homesteads, and a graduate student named David Chen, who'd been conducting research on historical mining sites. All had been working alone in remote areas when they disappeared. All had left behind personal belongings and vehicles that suggested they'd planned to return. All had simply evaporated from the landscape as if they'd never existed. The Frontier Motel's parking lot contained only 3 vehicles when Morrison arrived. Helen's aging Subaru, a pickup truck belonging to a ranch and staying temporarily in town, and a late-model Honda Accord with Colorado plates that presumably belonged to the missing geologist. Morrison noted that the Honda was parked directly in front of room 7. Positioned as if the driver had intended a brief stop rather than an extended stay, Helen met him at the motel office, her usual professional demeanor strained by obvious anxiety. "Sheriff, I want to be clear that we respect our guests' privacy, but Dr. Kim was supposed to check out on Tuesday morning. When she didn't, we assumed she decided to extend her stay and forgot to notify the front desk. But when we tried to contact her yesterday and got no response, we started getting concerned. When did you last see her personally?" "Monday evening around 6 Masak. She asked about restaurants in town and seemed normal, friendly, professional, looking forward to completing her work. She mentioned she was mapping geological formations in the Red Canyon area for the State Geology Department." Morrison felt the familiar tightness in his stomach that came with cases that were about to become complicated. Red Canyon was 25 miles northeast of the motel, accessible only by rough Forest Service roads that wound through some of the most isolated terrain in Clearwater County. If Dr. Kim had encountered trouble in that area, her chances of survival would depend entirely on how quickly she could be found. "Show me the room, Helen." Room 7 appeared normal at first glance. A standard motel room with 2 double beds, a small table, and basic furnishings. Dr. Kim's belongings were arranged with the orderliness of someone planning an extended stay. Clothes hung carefully in the closet, toiletries organized on the bathroom counter, and geological equipment arranged on the table near the window. But as Morrison examined the room more carefully, details emerged that suggested something was fundamentally wrong. The bed appeared to have been slept in recently, but the linens were arranged too neatly, as if someone had made the bed with unusual care. Dr. Kim's purse sat on the dresser, but its contents had been rearranged. Driver's license, credit cards, and cash were visible, but her cell phone and car keys were missing. Most disturbing was what Morrison found in the room's small trash can. Fragments of what appeared to be a cell phone deliberately broken into pieces too small to be repaired or analyzed. "Helen, I need you to think carefully," Morrison said as he photographed the broken phone components. "Besides Dr. Kim, have you seen anyone else around the motel in the past few days? Anyone who seemed to be watching the building or showing unusual interest in the guests?" Helen's response came slowly, as if she was reluctant to voice a concern that had been building for days. "Sheriff, there's been a man in a dark pickup truck who's driven through the parking lot several times over the past week. I noticed because he never stops, never gets out, just drives through slowly like he's looking for someone or something. Can you describe him?" "Tall, maybe 6 FT, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. The truck had Montana plates, I think, but I never got a clear look at the license number." Morrison felt pieces of a pattern beginning to emerge. A systematic observer, someone familiar enough with the area to know which roads led to remote locations, and now a missing person whose disappearance showed signs of careful planning rather than spontaneous accident or crime of opportunity. "Helen, I need you to secure this room and not allow anyone inside until our investigation is complete. I also want you to call me immediately if you see that pickup truck again." Morrison's next stop was the Red Canyon area where Dr. Kim had been conducting her geological research. The drive required 45 minutes on increasingly rough roads that eventually deteriorated into little more than tire tracks across open range land. This was country where a breakdown or wrong turn could leave someone stranded for days before anyone noticed their absence. Dr. Kim's research site was easy to locate, a collection of distinctive red sandstone formations that rose from the surrounding prairie like ancient monuments. Morrison found evidence of recent geological work, small holes where rock samples had been extracted, orange surveyor flags marking specific formations and tire tracks indicating a vehicle had been parked near the base of the largest rock outcropping. But there was no sign of Dr. Kim herself, and more troubling, no indication of what might have happened to her at the site. Her geological hammer lay beside a partially completed rock sample, suggesting she'd been interrupted during her work, but there were no signs of struggle or distress. Morrison expanded his search to include the surrounding area, looking for any indication of where Dr. Kim might have gone after leaving her research site. What he found approximately 200 YD from the rock formations stopped him cold. Hidden in a shallow depression that would be invisible from the road or the research site was a carefully concealed campsite. Someone had created a sophisticated hide that allowed them to observe the geological formations without being detected, a position that would provide clear views of anyone working in the Red Canyon area. The campsite showed evidence of extended occupation. Whoever had been using it had spent considerable time watching the research site, documenting the activities of anyone who worked there. Morrison found food containers, water bottles, and most disturbing, a collection of photographs that had been pinned to a makeshift bulletin board created from a piece of plywood. The photographs showed Dr. Kim working at various locations around the Red Canyon site, taken with a telephoto lens from the concealed observation position. But they also showed other people, individuals Morrison recognized from previous missing person cases. Marcus Torres, the hunting guide who disappeared 18 months earlier, was shown in photographs taken in a different location, but with the same telephoto perspective. Jennifer Walsh, the photographer who'd vanished while documenting abandoned homesteads, appeared in images that captured her at work in various remote locations across the county. Morrison felt his blood turned cold as he realized what he was looking at. Someone had been systematically stalking people who worked alone in remote areas of Clearwater County, studying their patterns and activities before making them disappear. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered as he photographed the evidence board. This isn't random. Someone's been hunting them. The implications were staggering. If the photographs were accurate, the missing persons cases that had puzzled Morrison for the past 2 years weren't isolated incidents. They were the work of a predator who had been operating undetected in Clearwater County's vast empty spaces. Morrison called for backup in the county's crime scene specialist, Deputy Lisa Chen, who had training in evidence collection and photography. While waiting for support to arrive, he continued his examination of the concealed campsite, finding additional evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Hidden beneath a camouflaged tarp was a collection of personal effects that Morrison recognized from previous missing person investigations. Marcus Torres's distinctive hunting knife, Jennifer Walsh's camera equipment, and items belonging to David Chen, the graduate student who disappeared while researching mining sites. The collection was organized with meticulous care, each item labeled with a date and location. This wasn't the chaotic accumulation of a disorganized criminal. It was the systematic collection of someone who took trophies from his victims and maintained detailed records of his activities. Most chilling was a hand-drawn map of Clearwater County that marked dozens of locations with different colored pins. Red pins indicated what appeared to be abduction sites, while black pins marked locations that Morrison didn't recognize, but which were scattered throughout the county's most remote areas. Sheriff Morrison, this is Deputy Chen. His radio crackled. I'm en route to your location with the crime scene kit. ETA 15 minutes. Lisa, contact the state police and request assistance from their major crimes unit. Morrison replied. We're looking at evidence of serial abduction, possibly connected to multiple missing person cases dating back at least 2 years. As Morrison waited for backup to arrive, he found himself studying the landscape of Red Canyon with new eyes. The area's isolation, which had always been part of its appeal for researchers and outdoor enthusiasts, now seemed sinister. Someone had been using that isolation as a hunting ground, taking advantage of the county's sparse population and vast empty spaces to conduct systematic predation. The realization that a serial predator had been operating undetected in his jurisdiction for years was both a professional failure and a personal nightmare. Morrison had always prided himself on understanding the criminal patterns in Clearwater County, but this predator had been sophisticated enough to make his crimes appear to be random disappearances rather than systematic abductions. Deputy Chen arrived with crime scene equipment and immediately began documenting the concealed campsite, while Morrison expanded his search of the surrounding area. What they found over the next 3 hours would fundamentally change how law enforcement approached missing person cases in rural Wyoming. The campsite was part of a larger network of observation positions scattered throughout the Red Canyon area. The predator had created multiple concealed locations that allowed him to monitor various approach routes and escape undetected if discovered. This level of preparation suggested someone with extensive knowledge of the terrain and considerable experience in surveillance techniques. "Sheriff, look at this." Chen called from a position about 100 yards from the main campsite. "There's a trail leading away from here, and it looks like it's been used recently." The trail was barely visible, a series of disturbed ground markers and broken vegetation that would be undetectable to anyone without tracking experience. Morrison had grown up hunting in this country and recognized the signs of someone who knew how to move through wilderness areas without leaving obvious traces. Following the trail for approximately half a mile, they discovered something that explained what had happened to Dr. Sarah Kim and possibly the other missing persons. Hidden in a narrow canyon that cut deeper into the Red Canyon Formation was a natural cave system that had been modified into a holding facility. The cave entrance was concealed by carefully arranged brush and rocks, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Inside, Morrison and Chen found evidence that someone had been using the cave to hold captives for extended periods before moving them to permanent disposal sites. The cave had been equipped with restraints, basic supplies for keeping people alive, and most disturbing detailed notes about the psychological responses of captives to prolonged isolation and fear. The predator wasn't just abducting people. He was studying them, documenting their reactions to captivity as part of some twisted experimental process. "Sheriff, we need to search this entire cave system," Chen said as they documented the holding area. "If Dr. Kim is still alive, she might be somewhere in these caves." The search of the cave system took 4 hours and required additional personnel from the State Police Search and Rescue Team. What they found confirmed Morrison's worst fears while providing crucial evidence about the predator's methods and possible identity. Dr. Sarah Kim was discovered in a deeper section of the cave system, alive but in critical condition from dehydration and exposure. She had been held captive for 4 days, restrained but provided with minimal food and water to keep her alive. While her captor conducted what appeared to be psychological experiments, he said he was studying isolation responses. Dr. Kim whispered to Morrison as paramedics prepared her for evacuation, took notes about how people react to being alone in the dark, how long it takes for someone to break psychologically. "Can you describe him?" "Tall, maybe 6'2", brown hair going gray. Spoke like an educated man, used scientific terminology. "Sheriff, he said I was number 7, that he'd been perfecting his methods for years." Morrison felt a cold certainty settle over him. Number 7 meant there had been at least 6 previous victims, confirming that the missing person cases he'd been investigating were all connected to this predator. Did he say anything about the others? About what happened to them? Dr. Kim's response chilled Morrison to the bone. He said the early subjects weren't as cooperative, that he'd had to move them to permanent storage locations before completing his studies. "Sheriff, I think he's been killing people and hiding their bodies somewhere in this county." The cave system yielded additional evidence that painted a picture of a predator who had been operating in Clearwater County for at least 3 years, systematically abducting people who worked alone in remote areas and using them as subjects for psychological experiments before disposing of them in locations that had never been discovered. Among the evidence was a detailed journal that documented the predator's activities, including descriptions of his previous victims and their responses to captivity. The journal was written in a scientific style, treating human abduction and murder as research subjects rather than crimes. Most valuable was a hand-drawn map that showed the locations where previous victims had been buried. The map marked 6 sites scattered throughout Clearwater County's most remote areas, locations that would require extensive search operations to locate and excavate. Sheriff, we're looking at one of the most sophisticated serial killer operations I've ever seen, said Detective Ray Martinez of the Wyoming State Police, who had arrived to coordinate the expanded investigation. This predator has been using scientific methodology to study his victims while conducting a systematic murder spree across your county. The journal entries revealed a disturbing pattern of escalation. The predator's early victims had been killed relatively quickly after abduction, but over time he had developed more elaborate methods for studying their psychological responses to captivity and isolation. Dr. Kim had survived because she was part of what the journal described as Phase 3 of the predator's research, an attempt to develop more sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that required keeping subjects alive for extended periods. He's been treating human beings like laboratory animals, Morrison realized as he studied the journal entries. This isn't just serial killing, it's systematic torture disguised as research. The investigation that followed would ultimately reveal one of the most methodical and scientifically oriented serial killing operations in Wyoming's history. The predator had been conducting what amounted to psychological experiments on his victims, documenting their responses to various forms of isolation, fear, and manipulation before killing them, and disposing of their bodies in carefully selected locations. But as Morrison coordinated with state and federal authorities to expand the investigation, he realized that identifying and capturing the predator would require understanding not just his criminal methods, but his scientific background and psychological motivations. The journal entries suggested someone with advanced education in psychology or related fields, someone who viewed human subjects as research materials rather than fellow human beings. The level of organization and methodical approach indicated a predator who might appear completely normal in social situations while conducting systematic murder in his private time. Detective Martinez, we need to expand this investigation beyond just law enforcement, Morrison said as they planned to the next phase of the operation. We are looking for someone with scientific training who's been using Clearwater County as his personal laboratory for human experimentation. The search for the predator would require resources and expertise beyond what local law enforcement could provide. But Morrison was determined to bring justice for the victims who had vanished into Wyoming's empty spaces and ensure that no one else would disappear into the predator's twisted research program. As evening approached over the Red Canyon, Morrison looked out at the vast landscape that had always been his home, now tainted by the knowledge that someone had been using its isolation to conduct systematic murder. Somewhere in Clearwater County, a predator who considered himself a scientist was probably planning his next abduction, studying potential victims, and preparing for Phase 4 of his research program. The race to identify and capture him had begun. But Morrison knew that in a county where vast distances and sparse population provided perfect hunting grounds for predators, finding one methodical killer would require every resource at law enforcement's disposal and considerable luck. Dr. Sarah Kim's survival had provided crucial evidence and testimony, but 6 other victims remained buried in locations known only to their killer. Finding them and bringing their families closure would require not just solving the crimes, but understanding the mind of someone who had turned murder into a scientific discipline practiced in the emptiest corners of rural America. The identification of Dr. Richard Thorne came through an unexpected connection that revealed how perfectly he had hidden his criminal activities behind a facade of legitimate scientific research. 3 days after Sarah Kim's rescue, Morrison received a call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist with the Wyoming State Police, who had been reviewing the journal entries found in the cave system. Sheriff Morrison, I think I know who wrote these journal entries, Dr. Walsh said during their morning briefing at the State Police headquarters in Cheyenne. The scientific methodology, the specific terminology used to describe psychological responses, this matches the research style of someone with advanced training in experimental psychology. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, feeling the first spark of hope since the investigation had begun. What kind of connection are you thinking? I've been comparing the journal entries to published research papers in experimental psychology, looking for similar writing styles and methodological approaches. Sheriff, I found a match. Dr. Richard Thorne, a research psychologist who was dismissed from the University of Colorado 3 years ago for conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. The name meant nothing to Morrison, but Dr. Walsh's excitement was infectious. After days of investigating a predator who seemed to exist only in shadows, they finally had a specific individual to pursue. What kind of unauthorized experiments? Thorne was studying the psychological effects of isolation and sensory deprivation on human subjects, but he was conducting his research without proper consent protocols and pushing subjects beyond ethical limits. The university dismissed him after several students filed complaints about being subjected to psychological trauma during his experiments. Dr. Walsh spread out copies of academic papers and university records that painted a picture of a respected researcher whose pursuit of scientific knowledge had gradually evolved into systematic abuse of research subjects. Thorne's published research focused on what he called extreme isolation psychology, studying how people respond to being completely cut off from social contact and familiar environments. His work was considered groundbreaking but ethically questionable. Morrison studied Thorne's photograph from his university identification. A tall man in his late 40s with graying brown hair and the intense expression of someone completely absorbed in intellectual pursuits. The physical description matched what Dr. Kim had provided during her debriefing. Where is Thorne now? That's where it gets interesting. After being dismissed from the university, he disappeared from academic circles completely. No forwarding address, no new employment records, no publications or conference appearances. It's like he vanished from the scientific community 3 years ago. The timeline was perfect. Thorne's dismissal from the university coincided exactly with the beginning of the missing person cases in Clearwater County, suggesting he had relocated to Wyoming specifically to continue his research using methods that would never be approved by any legitimate academic institution. Dr. Walsh, I need everything you can find about Thorne's background. Property records, vehicle registrations, financial history, anything that might tell us where he's been living for the past 3 years. The investigation into Richard Thorne's activities since leaving the University of Colorado revealed a carefully planned transition from legitimate academic research to systematic criminal experimentation. Using resources from multiple agencies, investigators traced a complex pattern of property purchases, vehicle registrations, and financial transactions that showed how Thorne had established himself in rural Wyoming. 18 months earlier, Thorne had purchased a remote ranch property under the name of a shell company he'd created for conducting private research consulting. The 640-acre property was located in the most isolated section of Clearwater County, accessible only by a private road that connected to the Forest Service network Thorne had been using to access his observation sites and the cave system. "Sheriff, look at this," Deputy Chen said as she reviewed property records at the courthouse. Thorne's ranch is positioned almost exactly in the center of all the missing person disappearance sites. He could reach any location in the county within an hour's drive from his base of operations. Morrison studied the map Chen had created, noting how Thorne's property provided perfect access to the remote areas where he had been conducting his abductions. The ranch's isolation also meant he could hold captives and dispose of bodies without any risk of detection by neighbors or casual observers. What kind of improvements has he made to the property? That's where it gets really disturbing. Jen replied, consulting the building permit records. Thorne has constructed what he described as research facilities, including underground storage areas and what the permits describe as specialized laboratory spaces. The building permits provided a blueprint for what appeared to be a sophisticated facility designed specifically for holding and studying human subjects. Thorne had created an underground complex that included multiple holding cells, observation areas, and what the permits euphemistically described as experimental chambers. Morrison felt sick as he realized the scope of Thorne's operation. This wasn't just a serial killer who disposed of bodies in remote locations. This was someone who had built a private laboratory for conducting systematic torture and murder while documenting the process as scientific research. "Lisa, I want surveillance on Thorne's property immediately, but we approach this carefully. If he's holding other victims, we can't risk triggering a situation that gets them killed." The surveillance operation began that afternoon with state police tactical teams positioning themselves around Thorne's ranch, while Morrison coordinated with federal authorities who had expertise in hostage situations involving psychologically unstable subjects. Aerial reconnaissance revealed the true scope of Thorne's facility. The ranch house appeared normal from above, but thermal imaging detected significant underground structures that extended far beyond what the building permits had described. Most concerning were heat signatures that suggested the presence of multiple individuals in the underground areas. Sheriff Morrison were reading at least 3 distinct heat signatures in the underground facility, reported Lieutenant Sarah Johnson of the State Police Tactical Team. Based on their positioning and movement patterns, it appears we have multiple captives who are being held in separate areas. Morrison felt his heart rate spike as he realized they were looking at a rescue operation involving multiple victims who had been held for unknown periods of time. The psychological condition of people who had been subjected to Thorne's experimental procedures was impossible to predict. What's our approach? We're treating this as a high-risk hostage situation with psychologically unstable subjects, Johnson replied. Our priority is securing the victims, but we have to assume Thorne has prepared for the possibility of law enforcement discovery. The tactical approach required careful coordination between multiple agencies. FBI behavioral specialists provided analysis of Thorne's psychological profile, suggesting he would view law enforcement intervention as disruption of important scientific work rather than criminal investigation. Thorne's academic background suggests he considers his activities to be legitimate research that's being unfairly restricted by conventional ethical standards, explained FBI psychologist Dr. Michael Rodriguez during the pre-operation briefing. He's likely to respond to law enforcement as he would to academic peer review, with intellectual arguments rather than violent resistance. Morrison hoped Dr. Rodriguez was right. But the evidence from the cave system suggested Thorne had evolved far beyond the frustrated academic, who had been dismissed from the university. The systematic nature of his crimes and the sophistication of his facility indicated someone who had fully committed to operating outside legal and ethical boundaries. The operation began at dawn with tactical teams approaching the ranch from multiple directions, while Morrison and federal agents prepared to negotiate with Thorne if possible. The goal was to secure the victims without triggering defensive actions that might result in their deaths. Thorne's ranch house was empty when tactical teams made entry, but they found clear evidence of recent occupation, including research notes, victim files, and detailed schedules for what Thorne described as experimental protocols involving the captives being held underground. Sheriff, we've located the entrance to the underground facility, reported Sergeant Mike Torres from the tactical team. Reinforced steel door with electronic locking systems. This was built for security, not convenience. The underground facility proved to be even more disturbing than the building permits had suggested. Thorne had created a sophisticated laboratory, complex that included holding cells, observation areas, and specialized chambers designed for conducting psychological experiments on unwilling subjects. The rescue team found 4 victims in various stages of Thorne's experimental process. Besides Dr. Sarah Kim, whom they already knew about, they discovered Marcus Torres, the missing hunting guide, Jennifer Walsh, the photographer, and David Chen, the graduate student, all of whom had been held captive for periods ranging from 6 months to 18 months. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered as he surveyed the underground facility. He's been running a human experimentation lab for years. The condition of the rescued victims varied dramatically based on how long they had been held and what experimental procedures Thorne had subjected them to. Marcus Torres had been captive the longest and showed signs of severe psychological trauma from extended isolation and manipulation. He told us we were contributing to important scientific research. Torres explained to Morrison during his initial debriefing at the hospital. Said our sacrifice would advance human understanding of psychological resilience. Sheriff, he kept detailed records of everything: how we responded to isolation, fear, sensory deprivation, all of it. Jennifer Walsh, who had been held for 14 months, provided crucial information about Thorne's experimental methods and the fate of earlier victims who hadn't survived the process. He called it the laboratory of isolation. Walsh told investigators said he was studying how people adapt to complete separation from society and normal human contact. The early subjects, he said, they weren't resilient enough for extended study. The implications were chilling. Thorne had been conducting systematic psychological torture while documenting the process as legitimate research, killing subjects who didn't meet his experimental requirements and keeping others alive for extended study periods. David Chen, the graduate student who had been researching mining sites when he disappeared, had been held for 8 months and subjected to what Thorne called cognitive adaptation protocols, systematic attempts to break down his psychological defenses and rebuild his personality according to research parameters. He believed he was creating better humans. Chen explained during his hospital interview said that by stripping away social conditioning and forcing people to confront pure isolation, he could study the essential nature of human consciousness. The underground facility yielded extensive documentation of Thorne's activities, including detailed records of all his victims and the experimental procedures he had used on each. The files confirmed that 6 people had died during Thorne's experiments, their bodies buried at locations marked on the map found in the cave system. But Thorne himself was nowhere to be found. The facility showed signs of hasty abandonment with some equipment still running, and research notes scattered as if he had fled when surveillance detected the law enforcement operation. "Sheriff, we found Thorne's escape route," reported Deputy Chen from a section of the underground facility that connected to natural cave systems. "He's got a tunnel that leads to the cave network where we found Dr. Kim. He could be anywhere in miles of underground passages." The search for Thorne expanded to include the entire cave system that honeycombed the area beneath his ranch property. Specialized cave rescue teams were brought in to navigate the underground network, but the passages extended for miles in multiple directions, providing numerous escape routes to surface locations throughout Clearwater County. Morrison coordinated with multiple agencies to establish a perimeter around the known cave exits, while search teams worked to track Thorne through the underground network. But after 48 hours, it became clear that Thorne had successfully escaped into Wyoming's vast wilderness areas. He's had years to prepare for this possibility, Morrison realized as he studied topographic maps of the cave system. Thorne knows this underground network better than anyone, and he's got supplies and escape routes we haven't even discovered yet. The manhunt for Richard Thorne continued for 3 weeks, involving resources from federal, state, and local agencies across the region. Thermal imaging helicopters, tracking dogs, and ground search teams covered thousands of square miles of wilderness areas where Thorne might be hiding. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Helen Rodriguez, the motel manager who had first reported Dr. Kim's disappearance, called Morrison with information about a guest who had checked in the previous evening and seemed unusually nervous about law enforcement activity in the area. "Sheriff, this man paid cash and seemed very interested in how long the police operation at Red Canyon was going to continue. Rodriguez reported something about him reminded me of the man in the pickup truck I'd seen watching the motel." Morrison and tactical teams surrounded the Frontier Motel within minutes, but found that Thorne had already abandoned the room. However, he had left behind crucial evidence. Research notes indicating he was planning to relocate his operations to a new area where he could continue his experiments without law enforcement interference. He's not done, Morrison realized as he read Thorne's notes. He considers this a temporary setback to his research program, not a permanent end to his activities. The notes indicated Thorne had been preparing backup facilities in remote areas of Montana and Colorado, suggesting he viewed his Wyoming operation as just one component of a larger research program that could be relocated and resumed elsewhere. "Sheriff Morrison, we're upgrading this to a federal manhunt with multi-state coordination," announced FBI Special Agent Patricia Williams, who had been assigned to lead the expanded investigation. Thorne represents a continuing threat to public safety across the entire region. The search for Richard Thorne continued for months, with occasional sightings and evidence suggesting he was moving through remote areas of the Rocky Mountain region. His academic training and survival skills made him a formidable fugitive who could remain hidden indefinitely in the wilderness areas he knew so well. But the successful rescue of his victims and the destruction of his Wyoming facility had ended his systematic experimentation on human subjects. The 4 survivors were receiving extensive psychological treatment and slowly recovering from their orals, while the remains of Thorne's earlier victims were recovered from burial sites identified through his research notes. For Morrison, the deal case represented both a successful law enforcement operation and a sobering reminder of how sophisticated predators could exploit rural areas, isolation to conduct systematic criminal activities. Thorne's laboratory of isolation had operated undetected for years in Clearwater County's empty spaces, taking advantage of sparse population and vast distances to conduct crimes that would have been impossible in more populated areas. We stopped him, but we didn't catch him, Morrison reflected during a debriefing session with federal authorities. Somewhere out there, Richard Thorne is probably setting up new research facilities and looking for new victims to study. The case established new protocols for investigating missing persons in rural areas, with enhanced coordination between agencies and improved methods for detecting sophisticated criminal operations that exploited geographic isolation. Morrison's department received additional training and resources for handling complex cases involving educated criminals who used rural areas as hunting grounds. Dr. Sarah Kim made a full recovery and returned to her geological research, though she never worked alone in remote areas again. Marcus Torres, Jennifer Walsh, and David Chen required extensive therapy, but eventually rebuilt their lives, becoming advocates for missing person awareness and improved law enforcement coordination in rural areas. The underground facility at Thorne's Ranch was demolished and sealed, but the case files remained open pending Thorne's capture. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American West, a predator who considered himself a scientist continued to evade justice. But he would never again find the perfect laboratory for human experimentation that he had created in Clearwater County's empty spaces. For Sheriff Jake Morrison, the investigation had proven that even the most sophisticated criminals could be defeated through careful police work and interagency cooperation. But it had also demonstrated that rural America's greatest strength, its vast empty spaces, could also be its greatest vulnerability when exploited by those who understood that isolation could hide even the most horrific crimes. The search for Richard Thorne continued, but the laboratory of isolation had been permanently closed, and the empty spaces of Clearwater County were once again safe for those who worked alone in the beautiful, dangerous landscape of rural Wyoming.